Welcome back. Settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already. Tonight we're going back to Spooner Street. Family Guy has been running for over 25 years. That is a staggering number when you sit with it. 25 years of Griffin family chaos, of cutaway gags and canceled plans and characters who changed so dramatically from who they started as that they barely resemble themselves anymore. And in all that time, almost every single season produced at least one moment that made someone, somewhere, absolutely furious. Whether that was a watchdog group filling out FCC complaint forms at their kitchen table, a former governor of Alaska posting on Facebook in indignation, an entire city processing collective grief while a cartoon joke got spliced into a conspiracy video, or just millions of regular viewers sitting on their couches wondering what happened to the show they used to love, controversy has followed this show like a faithful, somewhat unruly dog. So tonight, we are going to go through all of it. Season by season, controversy by controversy, the full, sprawling, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes genuinely disturbing story of every major moment that made people stop watching, start screaming, file paperwork, ban the show from their country, or sit quietly in their cars crying because a cartoon dog got hit by a car and they did not expect to care that much. This is going to take a while. That is the point. Section 1. The show that almost wasn't early battles and the first round of cancellations, 1999, 2002. To really understand why Family Guy generates controversy so consistently, you have to go back to where it started, because the seeds of everything that followed were planted in those very first episodes. The show premiered on the 31st of January, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. Which is one of the most coveted broadcast slots in all of American television. Tens of millions of people were already sitting on their couches with their drinks and their snacks, and Fox basically said, "Here, watch this cartoon about a mildly idiotic dad and his weird family." And those first viewers, all 22 million of them, watched. That is one of the largest premiere audiences in animated television history, and it happened not because Family Guy had yet built any real reputation, but simply because of timing. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when that pilot aired. He had gone to the Rhode Island School of Design, had done some work at Hanna-Barbera on shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory, and had made 2 short animated films that basically served as prototypes for what would become the Griffin family. The whole thing had a slightly scrappy energy to it, like something created by someone with a lot of ideas and not quite enough budget, which was accurate. The pilot had a certain handmade charm. The animation was rougher than what most primetime cartoons were delivering at the time. The humor was sharper and stranger than anything else on network television, and there was already, in those first episodes, a willingness to go places that other shows simply would not go. That willingness was, from the very beginning, what got the show into trouble. The Parents Television Council, a conservative nonprofit watchdog organization that had already been monitoring broadcast television content for years, locked eyes on Family Guy almost immediately. They had been watching closely since the show's debut, cataloging every joke that pushed against their standards for appropriate family programming, and within the first season they had already begun generating formal complaints. The PTC would go on to name Family Guy the worst show of the week at least 40 separate times since 2005. That is a staggering number. To put it in perspective, that means there were entire years where the PTC was watching Family Guy, finding something objectionable, writing it up, and declaring it the single worst thing airing on American television that week, and then doing it again the following month. They were essentially producing a parallel critical review of the show in the form of moral outrage, except instead of star ratings, they were filing paperwork with the Federal Communications Commission. What was the early show doing that upset people so much? Quite a lot, actually. The very first episode, Death Has a Shadow, involves Peter Griffin getting fired from his job at a toy factory after he falls asleep during a safety training video while drunk. He then fraudulently collects welfare checks and uses the money to buy his family things he thinks they need, like a helicopter and a jazz band. The whole premise is built on government fraud, public intoxication, and parental irresponsibility, and it is played entirely for laughs. For the PTC, this was exactly the kind of thing that broadcast television should not be celebrating, particularly when it aired in a time slot that many families might be watching together. What is interesting about this complaint, in retrospect, is how mild the first episode actually is compared to what the show would do later. Peter losing his job because he was drunk on the job and then committing welfare fraud would barely register as a controversy by the standards of seasons 8 through 15. But in 1999, the specific offense was more about the framing than the content. The show wasn't just depicting a character who did these things. It was depicting them with warmth and affection, inviting the audience to find Peter charming and sympathetic even as he was doing objectively irresponsible things. The PTC's concern was not simply that bad behavior was depicted. It was that bad behavior was being made lovable, which they felt was a kind of endorsement. This is a nuanced complaint, actually more nuanced than the PTC usually gets credit for. There is a real argument to be made that the way comedy frames morally questionable behavior can matter independently of whether the behavior is depicted. A show can depict theft while condemning it. A show can depict theft while making the thief charming and the theft funny, which sends a fundamentally different message. Family Guy, from its very first episode, was firmly in the second category, and the PTC understood this clearly even if they expressed their objection in terms that were sometimes less measured than the underlying point deserved. But the early battles were about more than just Peter's irresponsibility. The show was pushing on religion pretty hard from the start. It was making jokes about race. It was depicting Stewie, an infant, as a fully operational supervillain who openly fantasized about murdering his own mother. From the first episode, Stewie was building weapons in his bedroom, scheming about world domination, and delivering elaborate monologues in a refined British accent about his hatred for the woman who gave birth to him. For conservative watchdog groups, having a baby on a primetime cartoon explicitly discuss wanting to kill his mother was not something they could look past, even if the joke was clearly absurd. The PTC wasn't exactly known for appreciating absurdism. The early years also produced one of the show's most enduring censorship stories. Season 3, Episode 22, was an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The plot involved Peter coming to the conclusion that the reason his family was struggling financially was that they didn't have a Jewish friend to help manage their money. He befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, becomes convinced that having Jewish friends is the key to financial success, and eventually attempts to have Chris secretly converted to Judaism. The episode was clearly meant as satire of anti-Semitic stereotypes, using the comedy to expose the absurdity of the thinking rather than to endorse it. But Fox's executives were not convinced that the satire would land the way the writers intended, and they pulled the episode from broadcast. It was originally supposed to air in 2000, but was held back until 2003, after the show had already been canceled, at which point it finally made it onto Adult Swim. The episode was controversial enough that Fox sat on it for 3 years, which is a remarkable act of institutional nervousness about a cartoon. Then there was the 9/11 problem. In an early episode, there was a cutaway gag in which Stewie sang a song while distracting airport security from seeing the weapons in his luggage. The gag included a reference to Osama bin Laden. When that episode first aired, this was just a dark, absurdist joke. After the 11th of September 2001, it became something that nobody wanted on television. The scene was cut from reruns, removed from the first volume DVD release, and has had a complicated afterlife ever since. It's the kind of moment that serves as a timestamp for an era, one of those jokes that captures something specific about how the world felt before a particular Tuesday morning, and after that morning, could never feel the same way again. McFarlane himself has spoken about the fact that he had a ticket on one of the planes that crashed that day. He missed his flight because of a hangover, which is one of the stranger footnotes in the history of American television. The strange double quality of this fact, that the creator of a show that regularly made jokes about death and terrorism had personally and inadvertently survived a terrorist attack due to being hungover, is the kind of thing that would feel too on the nose in a piece of fiction. McFarlane has spoken about it with a kind of philosophical weight, the awareness that he was the specific person who was not on that plane by accident, and what that means for how you think about your own work and its relationship to mortality and humor. Family Guy had always been a show willing to laugh at death. After September 11th, that willingness existed in a different context, and the show had to navigate that context carefully. For the most part, Family Guy did handle 9/11 content with more care than its critics might have predicted. The airport security scene was edited without much internal debate. References to the attacks in later episodes tended to come from characters who acknowledged their weight, rather than simply deploying them as shock comedy. The show understood, at least during the years when MacFarlane was most actively involved, that some material required a different kind of handling. That the things that most deeply affected real people needed something more than a quick punchline and a return to the main plot. This awareness was part of what made early Family Guy more sophisticated than its reputation sometimes suggested. The show's critics tended to focus on its most extreme moments and project that extremity across the whole show. But the early seasons also had genuine restraint in specific areas, a sense of what could be pushed and what should be left alone, a judgment that came from the specific sensibility MacFarlane brought to the work. When that sensibility became less present in the production, some of that restraint faded, and episodes that felt like they were reaching for darkness without sufficient respect for what they were touching became more common. Through seasons 1, 2, and 3, the show was producing content that made its critics furious on a regular basis. The jokes about AIDS, about disability, about race, about religion were all generating complaints. But the show was also doing something that many critics at the time recognized as being genuinely clever. It wasn't just throwing offensive content at the screen. The early seasons had a structure to their humor, a sense that the writers were constructing jokes with actual thought behind them, using the shock as a tool rather than as a goal. The controversy was never really about Family Guy being stupid. It was about Family Guy being willing to be smart in ways that made people uncomfortable. The original writing staff deserves more recognition than it typically receives in discussions of what made the early show work. MacFarlane assembled a group that included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These writers came from different backgrounds with different comedic sensibilities, and the friction between those sensibilities was productive. The early show has a kind of creative argumentativeness to it, a sense that multiple points of view were colliding in the room, and that the jokes that survived had been tested against multiple ways of thinking about what was funny and what was too far. Gary Janetti, in particular, has spoken in interviews about the creative atmosphere of those early seasons and what it felt like to be in the room with MacFarlane and the rest of the staff at a moment when the show was finding its identity in real time. The sense of discovery that characterizes the first 3 seasons, the feeling that the writers were genuinely surprising themselves with what they were making, is something that is very difficult to sustain over a long run. By the time a show reaches its 8th or 10th season, the writers know the characters, the format, the range of acceptable comedy, the things that work, and the things that don't. The discovery has been replaced by competence, and competence produces different work than discovery. Mike Barker, who co-created American Dad with MacFarlane, left Family Guy to focus on that show and brought with him a specific set of instincts about how animated family comedy should work. Barker's influence on American Dad is visible in the show's commitment to character, consistency, and narrative structure, the things that American Dad did better than Family Guy as the years went on. His departure from the Family Guy writing room is part of the story of why the two shows developed so differently despite sharing a creator. The early episodes also benefited from a specific historical moment. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a period in which the boundaries of what could be shown on primetime broadcast television were actively being tested by multiple shows simultaneously. The Simpsons had already pushed many of those boundaries. South Park was doing so in a more extreme way on cable. NYPD Blue had established that certain kinds of content could exist on broadcast television in a different context. Family Guy entered this landscape at exactly the moment when the question of what was permissible was still being actively negotiated, and that timing gave the show a specific kind of energy. It was making arguments through its content about where the lines should be, and the arguments were happening against a backdrop where the lines were genuinely in motion. This is one reason why the PTC controversy felt so live during those early years. The watchdog group was not fighting a battle it had already lost. The regulatory environment around broadcast television content was still genuinely contested, and the FCC was still an active participant in those contests. The sense that the show might actually face meaningful consequences for its content gave the controversy an urgency that it would later lose as the regulatory battles settled into predictable patterns. By the middle of the show's run, the PTC Family Guy conflict had become almost ritualized. The PTC would object, the FCC would receive complaints, the FCC would decline to act, the show would continue. Everyone knew how the story would end, but in those first few years, the outcome was not entirely obvious. and that uncertainty made everything feel more charged. The show's relationship to its own potential consequences is itself a thread worth following through its 25-year history. In the early seasons, the creative team understood that they were operating near the edge of what was permissible and made creative decisions accordingly. Some of that awareness involved self-censorship of content that would have been too far even by the show's own standards. Some of it involved the specific choices about when to be provocative and when to pull back. McFarlane's instinct for this calibration was part of what made the show feel intentional rather than random in those early years. The provocations landed because they were placed carefully, because the writers understood that the shock needed to serve the comedy rather than replacing it. When that calibration was lost, somewhere in the middle seasons, what replaced it was a different approach. Be as extreme as possible and see what happens. The approach generated attention, generated FCC complaints, generated controversy. But it generated controversy of a different quality than the early show had generated. Controversy that came from excess rather than from intelligence, which is a much less interesting form of cultural friction. The early show's controversies were arguments about what comedy can do and who it can mock and what truth can look like in the form of a joke. The later show's controversies were arguments about whether specific content was appropriate, which is a flatter and less generative conversation. You can have the first kind of argument for a long time without resolution and produce genuinely interesting culture in the process. The second kind of argument tends to resolve itself when the content either becomes unacceptable enough to force action or mundane enough that people stop caring. Family Guy's later controversies mostly fell into the second category, too extreme for comfort but too predictable to generate anything beyond the expected complaints. But none of that mattered when it came to the ratings battle that was quietly destroying the show's chances of survival. Fox made a series of scheduling decisions in seasons 2 and 3 that look, in retrospect, like a slow institutional strangling of one of their own properties. In season 2, they moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 p.m., which put it directly against Frasier on NBC. Frasier was one of the most consistently acclaimed comedies on television, pulling in enormous audiences. Family Guy's ratings, predictably, dropped. Fox then moved it to Tuesday nights, where it went up against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which was at the absolute peak of its popularity as a cultural phenomenon. The ratings dropped further. Fox kept shuffling the show around without giving it any stable home, and the audience couldn't find it. By 2002, after the third season, Fox canceled Family Guy. The cancellation itself generated something like outrage, but a quiet outrage. The kind that doesn't make headlines because it's just fans being disappointed, rather than watchdog groups being incensed. People who had found the show loved it fiercely. They had connected with Brian's world weariness, with Stewie's villainous monologues, with the way Peter's stupidity was anchored by something that still felt like genuine love for his family. They didn't want it to go, but there wasn't much they could do except stop watching something that wasn't airing anymore. What happened next is one of the most genuinely unusual stories in the history of American television. Cartoon Network purchased the rerun rights to Family Guy for their Adult Swim late-night programming block for almost nothing. The show was considered a canceled property with marginal value, a Fox experiment that hadn't worked out. Adult Swim began airing Family Guy reruns on the 20th of April 2003, and what happened was immediate and remarkable. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block almost overnight. It dominated late-night viewing in a way that nobody had anticipated, and it boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by an extraordinary amount. At the same time, the DVD releases of the first and second seasons were selling at a pace that defied all expectations for a canceled cartoon. More than 400,000 copies sold. That doesn't sound enormous by today's streaming numbers, but for physical DVD sales of a canceled animated show in 2003, it was a significant signal that something was happening. There was a hunger for this content that the cancellation had not addressed. People weren't just moving on. They were buying episodes and rewatching them and telling their friends, and the audience that Fox thought they had lost turned out to have simply been waiting. By 2004, Fox made the decision to bring the show back. A fourth season was ordered. The show that had been canceled twice would return in 2005, riding a wave of goodwill and genuine fan excitement that almost never greets a revived television series. Usually when a show comes back from cancellation, it does so quietly, with lowered expectations on all sides. Family Guy came back with something closer to a victory lap. But here is the thing about victory laps. They feel wonderful in the moment, and then you have to keep running. The show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had been canceled in 2002, and the differences, while subtle at first, would compound season by season until they became impossible to ignore. The writing staff had scattered during the 3-year gap. The tone had shifted. MacFarlane himself was already beginning to spread his creative energy across other projects. The revival that everyone had celebrated was also, without anyone quite realizing it, the beginning of the end of the version of Family Guy that people had fought to bring back. We'll get to all of that. But first, let us rest in the early years for a moment longer. In those first 3 seasons, the show was finding its footing and generating real controversy in the process. The Parents Television Council was furious. The FCC was receiving complaint letters. Episodes were being held back or edited. And yet, through all of it, there was something about Family Guy that felt alive, in a way that its critics couldn't quite kill. The show was making people angry because it was good enough to matter. When a show is genuinely bad, nobody bothers to complain. They just change the channel. The fact that so many people were already outraged by Family Guy in those first 3 seasons was, in a strange way, proof of its power. Hey, before we move on, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something genuinely lovely about knowing someone in Tokyo or Toronto or Tucson is settling in with this right now. And if you haven't already, a subscribe costs you nothing and helps more than you'd think. Section 2. The Resurrection and its Discontents. The Revival Era and its First Major Controversies. 2005, 2007. When Family Guy returned for its 4th season on the 1st of May 2005, it landed in the middle of Fox's Sunday night animation domination block, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new MacFarlane creation called American Dad. The return was treated as a television event, something that simply did not happen in the industry. Shows that got canceled stayed canceled. The revival of Family Guy was genuinely unprecedented in how organic it was. Driven by rerun ratings and DVD sales rather than by network strategy or studio calculation. But something had changed during those 3 years away. The most obvious change was the animation. The early seasons, particularly seasons 2 and 3, which were handled by Rough Draft Studios, had a certain loose, expressive energy. The characters moved with a kind of elasticity that felt alive. The outlines were irregular in a way that suggested real drawing rather than mechanical reproduction. When the show returned for season 4, the animation was cleaner, smoother, and somehow also stiffer. The outlines were thicker and more uniform. The movement was more contained. The whole visual identity of the show felt more polished in some ways and less vital in others. Different animation studios were brought in across different seasons of the revival era, and the inconsistency in style became something fans noticed and debated, even when they couldn't quite articulate why it bothered them. The writing, though, was the bigger change. Seth MacFarlane had been public about one of the unintended consequences of the show being canceled twice every time the show went away. The writing staff scattered, and when it came back, they had to rebuild the room with new people. Those new people were talented, but they brought different sensibilities. The balance between the different elements of the humor shifted. The cutaway gags, which in the first 3 seasons had functioned as a bonus layer on top of solid episode plots, started becoming more central to how episodes were structured. They got longer. They got more frequent. And the main storylines got correspondingly thinner, as though the plot was now just a delivery mechanism for getting from one gag to the next. For a while, this didn't generate the kind of controversy that would come later. The humor was still mostly sharp enough, and the show's return had generated enough goodwill that audiences were willing to be generous with it. But there was one area where the revival era produced its first genuinely serious criticism, and that was in how the show handled Stewie. In the first 3 seasons, Stewie Griffin was one of the most original character concepts in American television. He was a 1-year-old baby who spoke like a Bond villain, built advanced weapons in his crib, and devoted his considerable intellect to 2 goals: taking over the world and murdering his mother. The comedy of Stewie came from the contrast between what he looked like, a round-faced infant in a yellow shirt, and what he actually was, a supremely dangerous supervillain who simply happened to be too small to do most of the things he wanted to do. The absurdity was the point. He was a walking joke about how our ideas of innocence and danger don't always map onto reality, and he was delivered with such commitment that even viewers who found the premise unsettling often found themselves laughing at it anyway. Starting with the revival in season 4, The writers, including MacFarlane, decided they had taken the evil genius baby concept as far as it could go. The world domination plot started fading into the background. The attempts to kill Lois became less frequent. In their place, Stewie's softer, more emotionally vulnerable side started getting more screen time. He began showing signs of identity exploration that would gradually dominate his character arc for the next 15 years. He started spending more time with Brian, and their friendship, which had been a quiet background element in the early seasons, became one of the show's primary relationships. The controversy here was not the kind that gets filed with the FCC. It was the more personal kind, the sense among longtime fans that something irreplaceable was being retired. There were people who had connected specifically with evil Stewie, with the idea of this hilarious and slightly terrifying tiny supervillain, and watching that character slowly be replaced with a quirkier, more sensitive version was genuinely painful for them. They felt it the way you feel it when a restaurant you love changes its menu. Technically speaking, you can still go there. The food is still competent, but the thing you loved is gone, and nobody consulted you about it. The Season 5 episode Barely Legal, in which Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of sympathy, showed that even in the revival era the show could still write character-driven comedy with actual emotional stakes. Brian's discomfort at being the object of Meg's affection, and his eventual clumsy but genuine attempt to let her down kindly, was funny in the way that good comedy about awkward human situations is always funny, because the discomfort is specific and real enough to be recognizable. These were the moments that kept early revival Family Guy from being simply a machine for generating clips. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which aired during the 2007 to 2008 season, functions in retrospect as something like the last true expression of the original Stewie concept. In the first part, Stewie finally follows through on his years-long mission and apparently kills Lois. In the second part, Lois returns and there is a massive confrontation. These episodes were praised by fans and critics as some of the best the show had done, precisely because they committed fully to the evil genius premise and gave it an operatic send-off. They were exciting and dramatic and funny, in the way that only Family Guy at its best could be funny. And then the twist came. It had all been a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. Everything reset. And after those episodes, the evil Stewie concept was never really revisited in any serious way. Those two episodes were the farewell to a character that had made the show great, disguised as an adventure story. The show knew it was ending that version of Stewie, it just didn't announce it directly. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the revival era, a different kind of controversy was brewing, and this one was more culturally significant. The 2007 episode 420 from Season 7 followed Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional Rhode Island town where the Griffins lived. The episode was broadly comedic, more of a political satire than an earnest argument, and it did what Family Guy usually did with political topics, which was use the humor as cover for a fairly transparent set of opinions. Brian's progressive politics had always been part of the character, but in the revival era they started taking up more space, and 420 was an early example of an episode where the political agenda was pretty difficult to separate from the joke. The real-world fallout was something nobody had entirely anticipated. The Venezuelan government, watching this episode air on local networks, reacted with genuine official displeasure. Venezuela's justice minister at the time publicly criticized the episode as an example of United States cultural propaganda promoting drug use, and cable stations in the country were warned they could face fines for continuing to broadcast Family Guy. This was a cartoon about a Rhode Island family getting an official condemnation from a foreign government. That is an extraordinary sentence to type. The show had crossed a threshold from being domestically controversial into generating international diplomatic adjacent friction. Family Guy had gotten Venezuela to issue a warning to cable networks, which is not something that happens to many animated comedies. The writers' strike of late 2007 and early 2008 further complicated the picture. The Writers Guild of America went on strike in November 2007, and the strike lasted until February 2008. MacFarlane was a vocal supporter of the writers and joined the picket lines. Fox, however, made the decision to air 3 completed Family Guy episodes during the strike without MacFarlane's permission. They had the technical right to do this since the episodes were already produced, but airing them against the creators' wishes generated real friction. It was an early and visible crack in the relationship between MacFarlane and Fox, a preview of a tension that would grow considerably more visible in the years ahead. The strike disrupted the creative flow of the show in ways that are hard to fully quantify but easy to observe in the finished product. Television writers work on a schedule that involves planning months in advance. A 3-month interruption in the middle of production doesn't just delay episodes. It disrupts the momentum of story development, the muscle memory of a writing room that has been working together in a rhythm. When the show came back after the strike ended in February 2008, something had changed in the texture of the writing. It was subtle enough that most viewers couldn't have articulated it. But when you look at the show's trajectory season by season, the strike period marks a distinct before and after. Season 4 had also produced the first genuinely significant escalation in the treatment of Meg Griffin. In the first 3 seasons, Meg had been the ordinary one, the least interesting member of an extraordinary family. The jokes about her were about her being boring and unpopular. Starting in Season 4, the jokes shifted in a different direction. They became about her being ugly, unwanted, and somehow deserving of contempt. Other characters began reacting to her presence with actual disgust rather than just indifference. The humor around her became crueler. The seeds were being planted for what would eventually become one of the most controversial, long-running dynamics in the entire show. But in 2005 and 2006, it was still early enough that it mostly read as an escalation of an existing joke rather than a wholesale transformation of a character. The revival era also saw the show begin to engage with the Parents Television Council more directly. The Season 4 episode PTV followed Peter starting his own unregulated television network after the FCC began aggressively censoring broadcast content. The episode was essentially a direct satirical response to the PTC and the broader censorship battles the show had been fighting. Peter's network airs increasingly graphic content. The FCC, depicted as a pantomime villain, censors reality itself, blurring out things in everyday life. The whole thing was MacFarlane and the writers essentially looking at their critics and producing a 22-minute argument about why those critics were wrong. The PTC, to their credit or perhaps their frustration, considered filing an FCC complaint about the episode that had been made specifically to mock FCC complaints. These years, Seasons 4 and 5 and the beginning of 6 and 7, represent a strange middle period in the show's controversy history. The content was getting edgier. The characters were beginning their slow transformations. The PTC was getting angrier. Venezuela had issued an official complaint. An episode had been held from broadcast for 3 years over anti-Semitism concerns. The writers' strike had interrupted the show's creative momentum. And yet somehow, Family Guy was still mostly beloved. The ratings were solid. The fan base was loyal. The show had recently been named one of the top television cartoons by TV Guide. It felt from the outside like a show in its prime. What was happening underneath that surface was harder to see in real time. The changes that would eventually make the show almost unrecognizable from its first 3 seasons were already underway. They just hadn't reached the point where casual viewers could feel them yet. That point was coming. Section 3. The Flanderization Files. Peter Griffin's long, painful transformation. 2008-2015. There is a specific moment in the history of Family Guy where you can feel the show cross a line it never came back from. It doesn't happen in a single episode or a single scene. It happens gradually, across dozens of episodes, in the way that Peter Griffin slowly stops being a character you recognize and starts being something else entirely. Understanding that transformation is essential to understanding why the show generated so much sustained controversy in its middle and later seasons, because Peter is the center of the whole thing. When the person at the center of a show becomes someone you don't want to spend time with, the entire gravity of the show changes. In the first 3 seasons, Peter Griffin worked as a character because his stupidity was balanced by something genuine. He was dumb in the specific way that a lot of well-meaning but not particularly thoughtful people are dumb. He made bad decisions constantly. He misunderstood situations. He prioritized the wrong things. He could be frustrating and occasionally infuriating. But underneath all of that, there was a real love for his family that the show kept returning to. Peter loved Lois. He loved his kids, even when he was doing something that actively harmed them. At the end of most episodes in those early seasons, there would be a moment of genuine warmth, an apology, a hug, a recognition that whatever mess Peter had made, the family was still real and still mattered to him. That warmth did not survive the revival intact. Starting around season 8, which covers the 2009 to 2010 television year, Peter's character began what fans and critics would eventually label Flanderization. The term comes from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons, a character who started as a well-rounded, warmly religious neighbor and who slowly, over many seasons, had every interesting aspect of his personality stripped away until he was nothing but an extreme caricature of religious conservatism. Flanderization is what happens when the writers of a long-running show decide that a character's most memorable single trait is more useful as a comedic shorthand than the full complexity of who that character actually was. They start leaning on that one trait harder, and everything else falls away. For Peter, the trait that got amplified was stupidity, and the amplification eventually became so extreme that it fundamentally changed the moral register of what the show was doing. In the early seasons, Peter was dumb in a way that was sometimes endearing and sometimes frustrating, but was always grounded in something recognizable. He was a working-class guy who didn't have a lot of education or sophistication, but who genuinely tried to be a good person. In the later seasons, his stupidity was pushed so far that he became genuinely dangerous, and the show stopped expecting him to account for the damage he caused. He would do things that, if you map them onto a real person, would constitute abuse or criminal negligence, and the show would frame these things as comedy without offering any accountability. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired in 2011, contains a sequence that became a flashpoint for this criticism. In the episode, set during a hurricane that keeps the Griffin family trapped at home, Meg finally breaks. She turns on her family and delivers a speech that is, by any honest accounting, completely accurate. She tells Peter he is selfish, irresponsible, neglectful, cruel, and that his behavior would constitute abuse in the eyes of the outside world. Everything she says maps directly onto things Peter has done on screen. The scene is written with enough specificity and enough real pain that it briefly feels like the show is going to acknowledge the reality of what it has been doing to these characters. And then Peter laughs. He finds Meg's speech funny. He experiences no remorse, no shame, no recognition. The scene that could have been a turning point, the moment where the show stepped back from its own excesses, instead becomes a demonstration of how completely Peter has been hollowed out. The man who in season 1 would have been hurt and eventually moved by his daughter's tears now literally laughs at them. That's not character development. That is the complete inversion of a character. The episode 420 in season 7 had shown Brian leading a marijuana legalization campaign. An episode called Baby It's Cold Inside, in the later seasons, contains a scene where Peter and Lois are on a boat. Peter sees what he thinks is a shark fin approaching, and his immediate instinct is to shove Lois underwater and run. He pushes his wife into the water and flees to save himself. The fin turned out to belong to a dolphin. But the episode does not treat this as a crisis in the relationship, as evidence of something seriously wrong with Peter, or even as something particularly noteworthy. It is just another thing Peter did. The show moves on. This is the heart of the controversy around Peter's character. Not any single episode, but the accumulation, the pattern of behavior that the show normalized. In Internal Affairs, Peter convinces Joe Swanson, presented as one of his closest friends, to cheat on his wife. In other episodes, he is shown stealing candy from his baby son. He actively dislikes Meg in ways that go far beyond the thoughtless indifference of the early seasons and into something that reads as genuine contempt. He does things to his friends that are not the results of stupidity but of deliberate selfishness. And the consequences never materialize in any lasting way. One of the most discussed examples of this in the broader fan community is the treatment of Joe Swanson. Joe was introduced in season 1's episode A Hero Sits Next Door as someone the whole neighborhood admired. He was in a wheelchair, but he was tough and capable and confident, and Peter was actually jealous of Joe's popularity. That jealousy was a real thing. It told us something about Peter, about his insecurities and his genuine admiration for what he saw in his neighbor. Over the following seasons, Joe went from being the neighbor everyone looked up to being someone the show used primarily as the target of disability-related jokes. His wheelchair, which had been presented as a non-limiting aspect of a strong character, became the entire basis of how the show treated him. And Peter, who had once been jealous of Joe's strength, became one of the main sources of contempt directed at him. The arc of Peter's relationship with Joe mirrors the broader arc of Peter's character. He went from being someone who admired competence and felt genuinely inadequate in comparison to it, to being someone who mocked competence in others because he had lost any capacity for self-reflection. That loss of self-reflection is what makes him genuinely difficult to watch. A character who does bad things but recognizes, on some level, that they are bad, can still be sympathetic. A character who does bad things and finds them funny, who laughs at his own daughter's pain and shoves his wife into shark-infested water and faces no meaningful consequences for any of it, is not a lovable idiot. He is something much harder to justify. The critic and academic discussion around Peter's character evolution is actually quite substantial, and it touches on something genuinely interesting about how long-running serialized comedy works. In the early seasons, Peter's stupidity was grounded in something specific. He was a working-class man without much education, who processed the world primarily through his immediate desires and impulses. This is a recognizable type. There are people like this. They can be frustrating and occasionally infuriating, but they are also real. And the comedy that came from Peter in those seasons was the comedy of recognition, the specific pleasure of seeing something true about a certain kind of person, exaggerated for effect. As the show went on and Peter's intelligence was pushed lower and his cruelty was pushed higher, the comedy stopped being the comedy of recognition and became the comedy of spectacle. You weren't laughing because you recognized something true. You were laughing, if you were laughing, because something extreme had happened and your brain registered the extremity. These are genuinely different kinds of laughter. The first kind leaves you feeling like you understood something. The second kind leaves you feeling slightly off, like you consumed something that tasted fine in the moment but sat uncomfortably afterward. What the writers seem to have discovered and then leaned into too hard was that extreme behavior is efficient. It generates a reaction quickly. You don't have to build to it with characterization and setup. You can just have Peter do something outrageous, and the audience will react. The problem with efficiency in comedy is that it tends to produce diminishing returns. Each successive outrage requires a higher dose to generate the same response. And the higher you push the dosage, the further you move from the original character, and the closer you move to a caricature that shares a name with your original character but has little else in common with them. The criticism became loud enough that the show itself started to address it, which created its own layer of controversy. There were occasional episodes where Peter and Meg would have a genuine moment of connection. There was Peter's sister in season 14, which revealed that Peter had been abused by his own sister when they were children, and used that revelation to explain why he treated Meg the way he did. In this episode, Meg learns about Peter's past and they reconcile. It is a genuinely emotional sequence, one of the more carefully written moments in the later seasons. And then the following week, none of it happened. Peter was right back to treating Meg with contempt. The reconciliation existed in one episode and nowhere else. This is the pattern that most frustrated fans and critics over the long middle period of the show. Not that the writers were incapable of writing better versions of these characters. They clearly were capable. The episode Brian and Stewie from season 8, which locks those two characters in a bank vault overnight and has them talk honestly about their lives, their friendship, and Brian's suicidal ideation, is some of the most genuinely excellent television the show ever produced. The talent was there. The problem was that the show refused to let the better versions of its characters be permanent. Every improvement reset. Every emotional breakthrough was followed by a return to the baseline of cruelty and thoughtlessness that the show had come to rely on. By the time you get to Peter Griffin's peak period of controversy, roughly seasons 8 through 14, he had become something that the show's creator probably would not have recognized from his original pitch. The working-class dad who drank beer and made bad decisions but loved his family had become a character who was capable of genuine cruelty without remorse, who inflicted psychological and physical harm on his family members and his friends for entertainment, and who the show consistently declined to hold accountable in any meaningful way. Fan discussions about this were intense and ongoing. People who had grown up watching the show and identified with Peter in some way found themselves increasingly alienated. He had stopped being funny in a way that felt safe, and started being funny in a way that required the audience to either ignore the cruelty or find the cruelty itself entertaining. Some people found it entertaining. That is worth acknowledging. There was an audience for the more extreme Peter, for the character who went further than anyone expected and faced no consequences. Consequence-free transgression can be funny in animation, where the physical impossibility of what you're watching provides a natural buffer between the comedy and reality. But that buffer requires a certain kind of internal logic. And when the transgression moves from things that are impossible in real life to things that are entirely possible and just morally wrong, the buffer starts to fail. You can laugh at a cartoon character falling off a cliff because nobody actually falls off cliffs and bounces. It is harder to laugh at a cartoon character emotionally abusing his daughter, because daughters and emotional abuse are both very real. The line between cartoon violence and something more uncomfortable was being crossed repeatedly, and the viewing public noticed. The show's ratings began declining significantly through this period. It is difficult to establish a single cause for a ratings decline, and there are always multiple factors: the rise of streaming, the fragmentation of television audiences, the shift in viewing habits toward on-demand content. But it is also worth noting that the decline in viewership tracked fairly closely with the period in which Peter's character was at its most extreme. People were not just watching less Family Guy because their schedules changed. Many of them left because the show they had loved started to feel like something different, something less comfortable to spend time with. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin is the most visible and most discussed example of what happened to the characters in the middle period of the show, but it was not the only one. The same process was at work in Brian's arc, in Stewie's transformation, and in the systematic dismantling of Meg as anything other than a punching bag. Each of those stories has its own chapter in the controversy history. But Peter's story sets the context for all of them, because he is the show's protagonist, and what happens to the protagonist sets the emotional tone for everything else. When the main character of a show stops being someone you root for and starts being someone you recoil from, the show has a problem that no number of clever cutaway gags can solve. Section 4. The Dog Heard Round the World. Brian Griffin's death, resurrection, and what it said about the show. If Peter Griffin's character arc was the slow-motion collapse of something that used to be good, Brian Griffin's story is stranger and sadder and more complicated, because it combines a genuine character decline with one of the most extraordinary moments of mass fan outrage in the history of animated television. We are talking, of course, about the death and resurrection of the Griffin family's talking dog in late 2013, an event that made national news, trended globally on social media, generated over 100,000 signatures on a Change.org petition, and revealed something profound about the relationship between Family Guy's audience and the characters they had spent years caring about. But to understand why Brian's death hit the way it did, you have to understand what Brian had been before it, and what he had become in the years leading up to that moment. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Brian Griffin was the emotional anchor of the show. He was Peter's best friend and the voice of reason in a household that desperately needed one. He was well-read, sardonic, and thoughtful, with a dry wit that made him the perfect counterpoint to Peter's unrestrained chaos. He was also a failed writer, a dog who aspired to more than his circumstances allowed, and this combination of intelligence and frustrated ambition made him one of the most relatable characters on the show. People connected with Brian because they saw in him someone who understood the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be, and who kept going anyway, with Martini in paw and a certain world-weary dignity intact. He also had flaws, real ones, that kept him from being idealized. He drank too much. He had complicated feelings for Lois that he never quite resolved. He had a son from a brief relationship who he largely abandoned, which the show addressed and then mostly forgot about. He was capable of being judgmental and self-righteous in ways that his actual behavior didn't always justify. These flaws were important because they kept Brian feeling like a person rather than a straight man. Starting with the revival in 2005, Brian's character began shifting in ways that took those flaws and amplified them while simultaneously diminishing the qualities that had made him sympathetic. His political views, which had always been a part of who he was, started to take over his personality. In the early seasons, Brian having liberal opinions was just one aspect of a complex character. In the later seasons, the writers began using Brian as a vessel for political commentary, and entire scenes would be devoted to Brian delivering speeches that felt less like natural character expression and more like the writers using him as a megaphone. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's positions found this increasingly tedious, because it was no longer Brian talking. It was the writers, in a dog costume, talking. The episode that most fans point to as the precise moment when Brian became genuinely difficult to defend is Brian Writes a Bestseller, from Season 9. In this episode, Stewie encourages Brian to write a self-help book after years of Brian struggling with his novel. Brian takes the encouragement, writes the book, and it becomes enormously successful. He then becomes so arrogant that he treats Stewie, the friend who believed in him, with open contempt and cruelty. He belittles him. He dismisses him. He behaves as though the person responsible for his success is beneath him. This is not a character having a moment of weakness or being caught up in something beyond his control. This is a character choosing, consciously, to be terrible to the person who loves him most. And the show treats it as comedy rather than as a serious character failure. From that point, the list of genuinely bad things Brian does in the later seasons accumulates at a pace that becomes difficult to follow. He gives both Chris and Stewie herpes through careless behavior. He destroys Stewie's beloved stuffed bear Rupert by chewing it to pieces while drunk. In one episode, he finds a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into the ocean, begins to rescue her, and when he discovers she has a child and is therefore presumably married, he lets go of the car and lets both of them drown. He allows an innocent woman and her child to die because she is unavailable to date. The show presents this as a joke. The audience is supposed to laugh. The episode Jerome is the New Black, from Season 8, contains a now-famous scene in which Quagmire delivers an extended speech directly to Brian about why he hates him. Quagmire calls out Brian's pretentiousness, his failed writing career, his hypocrisy about being morally superior while behaving worse than anyone around him, his pattern of hitting on Lois right in front of Peter, and his abandonment of his own son. Every single accusation Quagmire levels at Brian is supported by things the show has actually depicted. The speech was clearly intended to function as a valve for the audience's growing frustration with Brian, a moment where the show acknowledged what its viewers were feeling and gave voice to it. But here's the remarkable thing. The speech changed nothing. Brian continued behaving exactly as he had before. If anything, his behavior escalated after that episode. The writers seemed to recognize that the audience found Brian insufferable, and their response was not to fix him, but to make him more insufferable, and then turn that insufferability into a recurring storyline with Quagmire. Rather than correcting the problem, the show leaned into it as a source of comedy. Then came the 24th of November, 2013, Season 12, Episode 6, titled Life of Brian. The episode began like a normal Family Guy episode. There was a plot line about Stewie destroying his time machine to prevent further temporal accidents. And then, in a moment that the show treated with surprising seriousness, Brian was hit by a car while the family was playing street hockey in the road. He was rushed to the veterinarian. His injuries were deemed too severe. The Griffins gathered around him as he died. Peter, Lois, and Stewie said goodbye to the family dog, and Brian Griffin, a character who had been a fixture of the show since the first episode in 1999, died on the operating table. The scene was quiet and genuinely moving, especially by Family Guy standards. There was no joke at the moment of death. The family's grief was depicted with something approaching sincerity. And then, within the same episode, a new dog was introduced, Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, in what was clearly a deliberate bit of casting, bringing the distinctively Italian-American energy of a Sopranos actor to the Griffin household. By the end of the episode, Vinny was being positioned as Brian's replacement. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. The hashtag #BringBackBrian began trending on Twitter within hours of the episode airing. A Change.org petition demanding Brian's return gathered more than 100,000 signatures. Major news outlets ran stories about it. The story trended globally on social media for days. Seth MacFarlane later said, with some apparent genuine surprise, that the reaction had taken the whole production team completely off guard. He had expected some upset. He had not expected rage of that magnitude. The outpouring of grief for a fictional cartoon dog was, by the standard of cultural moments in 2013, remarkable. What the reaction demonstrated was something that the show's detractors might not have fully appreciated. Even at a point in the series where Brian had become genuinely difficult to sympathize with, the audience still cared about him. Even in his flawed, insufferable later seasons form, Brian was someone the audience had spent years with, and the idea of a Family Guy without him was genuinely distressing. The connection people had formed with the character was real, and the show had underestimated how real it was. The specific criticism that emerged from the death was layered. On one level, fans were simply upset because they loved Brian and didn't want him gone. On another level, fans were furious because the death felt cynical. The show had killed off a major character not because the story demanded it, or because the character's arc had been completed, but apparently, based on later statements from executive producer Steve Callahan, primarily to shake things up and create a reaction. The emotional manipulation was intentional. Brian had not died for artistic reasons. Brian had died to generate exactly the kind of outrage that was currently flooding social media. There is an important distinction worth drawing here between the death of a beloved character as a genuine story choice and the death of a beloved character as a rating strategy. Shows make both kinds of decisions. When The Wire killed off significant characters, it was because the show's world had internal rules that demanded those deaths, because those deaths served the story's larger argument about power and systemic violence, and the people ground up by both. Those deaths were tragic in the classical sense. Inevitable, given who these people were in the world they inhabited. Brian's death in Life of Brian had none of that quality. There was no narrative logic that required it. Brian's story had not reached a natural terminus. The decision was made, by the production's own admission, because the writers thought it would create a stir. That transparency about the motive, once it became known, was what transformed fan disappointment into fan fury. Being manipulated emotionally is unpleasant. Being told openly that you were manipulated emotionally, after the fact, is something categorically worse. It suggests that the people responsible for the manipulation did not feel they owed the audience better. The resurrection, 2 episodes later, was handled with a kind of breezy confidence that read to many viewers as dismissive. The episode Christmas Guy brought Brian back through time travel, and the show presented his return as a warm, emotionally satisfying moment. Stewie going back in time because he couldn't live without his best friend. This was genuinely moving in isolation. The problem was the context surrounding it. The death had been a stunt. The grief had been artificial. The return confirmed that none of it had mattered, and the emotional scene celebrating the return was therefore built on a foundation of manipulation rather than genuine story. You cannot have the catharsis without having earned the tragedy. McFarlane's Reddit AMA response to the fan reaction was, perhaps inadvertently, the most revealing thing anyone said about the whole episode. He described being surprised by the size of the reaction. He noted that the positive spin was that people still cared about the character, which was cool. The framing of fan grief as data about audience engagement, as a signal about whether people still give a certain number of expletives about a character, is a very specific way of relating to your audience. It is not wrong, exactly, but it suggests a relationship between creator and audience that is fundamentally instrumental, in which the audience's emotional investment exists as a resource to be assessed rather than as a form of trust to be honored. The families watching Family Guy had invested 14 seasons of emotional engagement in Brian Griffin. They had watched him fail at writing and succeed at friendship, and struggle with his own worst impulses, and occasionally find his way back to something genuinely good. When he died, they reacted the way people react when they lose someone they have known for a long time. The show's response to that reaction was to note that it was larger than expected, and that it suggested the character still had value. The mismatch between what the audience brought and what the show received was total. 2 episodes later, on the 15th of December 2013, in the episode Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device to go back to the moment before Brian was hit by the car and saved his life. Brian came back. Everything reset. Vinny disappeared. Stewie's character bond with him gone. The new dog's entire arc erased. The period of mourning had lasted exactly 2 episodes, or about 3 weeks of real time. The fan community was split in its reaction. Some people were simply relieved and happy that Brian was back. Others felt profoundly cheated. They had been asked to grieve the loss of a major character, had experienced genuine emotional distress over it, and then been told that none of it had mattered. The death had been a stunt. The grief had been manufactured and then discarded. The show had used its audience's love for a character to generate attention and then immediately undone the cause of that attention. What the Brian death arc revealed, more than any other single event in the show's history, was a fundamental truth about what the show had become. In the early seasons, big character moments meant something because the show was committed to following through on consequences. Characters learned things, and those learnings persisted. Relationships changed, and those changes were permanent. The world of the show had a consistency to it that made the audience feel like the story was real in some meaningful way. By season 12, the show had fully committed to a model where nothing that happened in any given episode had lasting consequences. Characters could die and come back. Lessons could be learned and immediately forgotten. Relationships could be repaired in one episode and destroyed again in the next. The Brian death arc was the most spectacular and visible example of this model in operation. It was so spectacular, in fact, that it made national news. And the national conversation that followed was not just about whether Family Guy fans should feel cheated. It was about what the show had become. Whether a program that treated its own audience's emotions as a resource to be mined and then discarded had forfeited the right to those emotions in the first place. In the years following Brian's return, his behavior actually got worse. The qualities that Quagmire had identified in his famous speech became more extreme rather than less. Episodes like Brian the Closer, in which Quagmire actually helps Brian by paying for dental surgery, and Brian repays him by tricking him into buying a worthless property, demonstrated that the show had no intention of rehabilitating the character. Boys and Squirrels, in which Brian kills a baby squirrel that Chris and Stewie had been trying to protect, presented him as capable of casual cruelty towards small animals with zero consequence. And yet, scattered among all of this, there were flashes of the old Brian. Episodes where his warmth towards Stewie came through clearly, where his intelligence and loyalty reminded you of the character who had been such an important part of why the early show worked. The writers had not entirely forgotten who Brian was. They just couldn't seem to commit to being that version of him consistently. Brian was a character in a constant state of contradiction, capable of genuine warmth and capable of genuine monstrousness, sometimes in the same episode, and the audience never quite knew which version they were going to get. That uncertainty, combined with the memory of who Brian had been in the beginning, created a specific kind of melancholy that became attached to the character in his later years. You watched him and you could remember the dog who had been Peter's best friend and the voice of reason, and you could see the distance between that dog and the one on your screen, and the distance was sad. Not sad in the way that good tragedy is sad, where the sadness serves a purpose and illuminates something true. Just sad in the way that waste is sad, the feeling of watching something that used to be good become less than it was for reasons that don't quite add up to anything meaningful. Section 5. The Meg Debate: A Decade of Abuse and What It Cost the Show. Of all the controversies that Family Guy generated over its long run, the treatment of Meg Griffin is the one that generated the most sustained, the most morally serious, and the most complicated debate. The Brian death was a spectacular single event that made headlines for weeks. The Flanderization of Peter was a gradual deterioration that people noticed over years. But the Meg situation was something that just kept happening, season after season, at a level of sustained cruelty that went beyond any other example in animated television history, and eventually prompted genuine conversations about what the show was saying about real people and real experiences. In the first 3 seasons, Meg Griffin was a straightforward character with a clear role. She was the ordinary one. In a family that included a supervillain baby, a talking intellectually ambitious dog, and a father who regularly caused civic disasters, Meg was just a normal teenage girl. She was unpopular at school. She wanted to fit in. She had crushes that didn't work out. She tried to find her place in a family that was too chaotic to pay attention to her. The joke around Meg in the early seasons was about her ordinariness in an extraordinary context, and it was the kind of joke that many people, especially teenagers, could actually relate to. Being the least interesting person in the room is a universal experience. Starting with the revival in 2005, the nature of the jokes around Meg changed in a fundamental way. Rather than Meg being the ordinary one, she became the unwanted one. The jokes were no longer about her being boring. They were about her being ugly, her being repulsive, her being someone that other people actively did not want around. Other characters started reacting to her presence with physical disgust. Peter's occasional insensitivity toward her escalated into something that looked more and more like active dislike. The humor around Meg moved from the gentle comedy of relatability into something much harder and colder. By the time you get to the middle seasons, roughly season 8 through season 14, the treatment of Meg Griffin had become one of the defining features of the show. Peter actively despised his oldest daughter. He would fart in her face as entertainment. He would shove her. He would make comments about wishing she didn't exist. There was an episode in which a flashback revealed that Peter and Lois had attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was a baby. This was presented as a joke. The audience was supposed to laugh at the idea of parents trying to give away their newborn daughter. There was an episode in which Peter goes undercover at Meg's high school, befriends her peers, and ends up choosing the popularity of her social group over his own daughter, abandoning her for the company of teenagers who despised her. The wider world of the show conspired with the family in this treatment. At school, the bullying was depicted as constant and extreme. The popular girl Connie was relentlessly cruel to Meg across multiple seasons. Teachers were dismissive or worse. Strangers made cutting remarks. The town of Stoolbend appeared to have collectively agreed that Meg Griffin was below normal human consideration, and nobody ever questioned or interrupted this consensus. The actor who voiced Meg, Mila Kunis, publicly discussed the real-world impact of the character's treatment. People would approach her and use the show's dismissive catchphrase directed at Meg in real life to her face. The fictional cruelty had become so pervasive and so widely recognized that it had escaped the boundaries of the show and started existing as a cultural shorthand for the specific kind of contempt that the show directed at its own character. Someone would see Mila Kunis, an extremely successful actress and public figure, and think it was appropriate or funny to use the line associated with the character she voiced being publicly humiliated. That is a remarkable measure of how deeply the Meg joke had embedded itself in the culture. The most controversial single Meg-related episode, and the one that generated the most thoughtful and sustained criticism, was the Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired in 2011. In this episode, the Griffin family is trapped at home during a hurricane. The enforced proximity causes tensions to boil over, and Meg, after years of accumulated abuse both on screen and off, finally reaches her breaking point. She confronts her family. She tells Peter what he has actually done to her, names specific behaviors, describes the real consequences, delivers what amounts to an honest inventory of the damage. She tells Lois that she has failed as a mother. She is raw and specific and real in a way that Meg rarely was on the show. For fans who had been watching Meg endure abuse for season after season, this moment felt like justice. It felt like the show finally acknowledging that what had been happening was wrong, that Meg's suffering had been real and had costs, and that the people responsible for it needed to reckon with it. Then the episode did something that made a significant portion of the audience furious. After Meg's outburst, the rest of the family begins to fall apart. Without Meg absorbing their collective frustrations, Peter and Lois and Chris and Brian turn on each other. The family dynamic becomes chaotic and painful. And the episode ends with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily recanting everything she said. She accepts that her role in the family is to be the target. She agrees to go back to being the one who absorbs everyone else's damage, because without her performing that function, the family cannot survive. The show had given Meg a genuine moment of liberation, and then concluded that her liberation was too costly for the people around her, that she should surrender her dignity and her legitimate grievances to preserve the stability of the people who had been abusing her. Critics pointed out the troubling implications of this conclusion. The episode was, whatever its intentions, making an argument that abuse victims should accept their victimhood because their refusal to be victimized harms the people victimizing them. That standing up for yourself is selfish. That some people's proper role is to absorb other people's damage, and they should accept this gracefully. The writers may not have intended to make this argument. The episode may have been reaching for something more subversive, some kind of dark commentary on the system of emotional labor in families. But the text of the episode, as it actually aired, delivered the message described above, and the fan community response was immediate and angry. Seahorse Seashell Party is consistently ranked among the most disliked episodes in the show's history, not because of poor production values or lazy writing, but because of the conclusion it reached and what that conclusion said about how the show understood Meg. The criticism around Meg's treatment did eventually produce results, which is worth noting. Around season 14, the intensity of the abuse began to decrease. More women joined the writing staff, and there has been reporting suggesting that they pushed back against the sustained cruelty directed at the show's main female teenage character. By season 15 and into the later seasons, Meg began getting episodes where she was competent, even impressive. She started fighting back against bullies rather than just absorbing their cruelty. She showed strength and resilience. She became, in the later seasons, something closer to an actual character rather than a prop. But the damage from those 10 years had already been done. For roughly a decade, Meg Griffin had been reduced to a single joke, and the joke was always the same. She was ugly. She was unwanted. She was disposable. When that same joke gets repeated hundreds of times across hundreds of episodes, something changes in how it registers. It stops reading as a joke and starts reading as a belief system. The show appeared to believe genuinely that Meg Griffin did not deserve to be treated like a human being. And an audience that spent 10 years watching that message delivered repeatedly began to either accept it. The Meg controversy also fed into a broader conversation about what the show was doing with its female characters more generally. Lois Griffin, who had been depicted in the early seasons as a patient, competent, genuinely admirable person, navigating an incredibly difficult marriage with grace and intelligence, became increasingly cold and passive in the middle seasons. The warmth she had shown toward her children in the early episodes gave way to something more detached. Her arc, like Peter's, involved a kind of hollowing out, a stripping away of the qualities that had made her feel real. By the later seasons, Lois often seemed to exist primarily as a foil for Peter rather than as a character in her own right, which was a significant departure from the woman who had been one of the show's strongest presences in seasons 1 through 3. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, has spoken publicly about her character over the years in ways that suggest she had a genuine understanding of who Lois was and what made her interesting. Borstein's Lois was smart and warm and quietly powerful in the early seasons, capable of managing the chaos around her with something that approached grace. In the later seasons, Lois often seemed as though she had simply stopped trying to manage anything and had retreated into a kind of passive acceptance of the dysfunction around her. The evolution was not a choice, it was a drift. The result of writers paying less and less attention to who she was and more attention to whatever she needed to be for any given episode's plot. The show's treatment of Meg also intersected with a conversation that was happening more broadly in American culture during the 2010s about how comedy that targets specific groups and specific vulnerabilities functions. The discourse around comedy, harm, and who carries the cost of certain jokes had not yet become as developed as it would be by the late 2010s, but the questions were being asked. When a joke relies on the humiliation of a specific character, who benefits from that joke and who pays for it? When the punchline is always the same person's suffering, what does the show's consistent return to that punchline communicate about how it understands that person? Family Guy's treatment of Meg was, during its most extreme period, something that many critics felt crossed from comedy into something more accurately described as ritual humiliation. Ritual humiliation, where a specific person is repeatedly brought forward to be mocked in front of an audience that laughs at their expense, is a very old form of entertainment. It is not the same as satire. It does not have a target beyond the person being humiliated. It does not say anything true about the world. It simply produces the pleasure of watching someone suffer, which is a pleasure that exists but which comedy at its best has generally tried to transcend rather than simply satisfy. The eventual improvement in Meg's treatment, which began around season 14 and 15 as more women joined the writing staff, is itself a story worth telling. The connection between who is in a writer's room and what kinds of jokes that room produces has been demonstrated across many shows and many contexts, and the Meg example is one of the clearest. When the people responsible for writing a teenage girl's experience included actual women who had been teenage girls, the writing changed. Not because men cannot understand or write female characters, but because the specific accumulated weight of those experiences changes what seems funny about a specific situation and what seems like it has already been beaten far past the point of humor. The later Meg, starting roughly from season 15 onward, is a different character from the Meg of the abuse peak. She fights back. She demonstrates competence. She shows resilience and strength. The show even acknowledged the change within episodes, having other characters react with surprise when Meg did something impressive, as though the previous decade of her being a doormat had also been noticed by the fictional world and not just the audience. These late-season Meg moments were better, and they proved again that the show was capable of treating all its characters with more dignity than it had often chosen to. What the Meg story ultimately tells us about the show's trajectory is something both specific and general. Specifically, it tells us that Family Guy was capable of being genuinely and carelessly cruel to its own characters in ways that went far beyond what could be justified by the logic of dark comedy. Generally, it tells us that the show was losing its ability to care about the inner lives of the people it had created. When you stop caring about your characters, when they become purely instrumental, existing only to serve the needs of whatever joke is in front of you, rather than existing as people with histories and feelings and developmental arcs, you have made a choice about what kind of show you want to be. Family Guy made that choice gradually and then all at once, and the Meg treatment is the most sustained and visible evidence of it. Section 6. The Watchdogs at the Gate, the Parents Television Council, the FCC, and 25 years of formal complaints. There is something almost comforting about the consistency of the war between Family Guy and the Parents Television Council. It spans the entire run of the show. It has generated more formal FCC complaints than almost any other program in broadcast history. It has produced some genuinely memorable exchanges, including Seth MacFarlane's famous description of the PTC as being like getting hate mail from Hitler, which is both an extreme comparison and also exactly the kind of response that was going to make the PTC angrier. It is a conflict that has its own internal logic, its own escalating cycles, and its own strange resolution, because after years of hostility, MacFarlane and PTC President Tim Winter eventually met, developed what appeared to be a genuine mutual understanding, and the PTC went on to praise MacFarlane's Orville, which is the strangest possible ending to a 20-year fight. The PTC had been paying attention to Family Guy since its debut in 1999. By 2005, when the show returned from its first cancellation, they had already developed a full institutional posture toward it. The show was regularly named the worst TV show of the week, a designation the PTC applied to programs they found particularly objectionable in a given 7-day period. Over the course of the show's run, Family Guy received this designation at least 40 times. That is an extraordinary number. It means that in any random stretch of Family Guy's existence, there were weeks where the PTC looked at everything airing on American broadcast television and decided that Family Guy was, at that moment, the single worst thing on any channel. Before the FCC battle over Family Guy became the most famous PTC Family Guy confrontation, there were earlier, equally revealing conflicts. In 2005, before the show had returned from its canceled state for even a full season, the episode The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire aired a cutaway gag in which Peter and a barbershop quartet sang and danced around the bed of a man who was dying of AIDS in a hospital. The joke involved performing an upbeat number for someone in the final stages of a devastating illness, and the contrast between the cheerful performance and the grim reality was the comedic premise. Multiple AIDS service organizations condemned the scene as irresponsible and disturbing, arguing that making light of AIDS patients' suffering sent a harmful message about how the disease should be regarded. The FCC received complaints. The network did not edit the episode but stated that the show's creative team took the concerns seriously. This was, diplomatically, probably not true in any meaningful sense, since the show continued to make similar jokes for years afterward. The formal FCC complaints generated by the PTC against Family Guy created a paper trail that is itself a remarkable document of 25 years of American cultural anxiety. Each complaint describes, in clinical and often jaw-dropping detail, exactly what content it is objecting to. The press release accompanying one complaint cited, to quote from it directly, content including bestiality, orgies, and babies eating sperm. This description corresponds to an episode called Family Gay from Season 7, which aired in 2009 and which became the single most complained about episode in the show's history, generating a reported 188,000 FCC complaints. The episode followed Peter enrolling in a medical experiment that results in him being injected with what the show calls the gay gene, causing him to temporarily be attracted to men. The episode contains scenes involving a gay orgy and, separately, a scene in which Stewie sits at the kitchen table eating what he initially believes is cereal, only to be told by Peter that some of the milk in the refrigerator is actually horse semen, which Peter has been keeping because he is attempting to breed horses. Stewie's reaction to this information, after a beat of processing, is to continue eating. The 188,000 FCC complaints generated by this episode set a record for the show and contributed to a formal PTC complaint that asked the FCC to investigate. The FCC, having reviewed the complaint, declined to take action, determining that the content, while clearly objectionable to many viewers, did not meet the legal definition of broadcast indecency. This outcome, a flood of complaints followed by regulatory inaction, became the typical pattern for FCC complaints against Family Guy. The complaints got filed, they got reviewed, and the FCC generally concluded that while Family Guy was undeniably offensive, it was not offensive in the specific way that American broadcasting law prohibited. The show itself became a kind of bellwether for these regulatory battles. The Season 5 episode PTV, which aired in 2005, was a direct satirical response to the PTC and to broader efforts to increase FCC regulation of broadcast content. In the episode, Peter starts his own unregulated television channel after the FCC begins censoring normal life as well as media. The episode is a 22-minute argument that the FCC's approach to broadcast standards is excessive and ultimately counterproductive, delivered in the specific style of a show that regularly pushed against those standards. The PTC considered filing an FCC complaint about this episode. The circularity is almost beautiful. McFarlane's most memorable comment about the PTC came in an interview in 2008. When asked about the organization, he said that dealing with their letters was like getting hate mail from Hitler, and went on to characterize them as terrible human beings who spent their days generating hatred toward content they found objectionable. This was not a diplomatic response. It was the kind of thing you say when you have been watching a specific organization target your work for nearly a decade and you have run out of patience for measured responses. The PTC, predictably, was not pleased by the comparison. But it was also exactly the kind of comment that McFarlane making it proved about the relationship. The animosity between the show and the watchdog organization had become completely mutual. For most of the show's run, this relationship existed in a state of hostility that had calcified into something almost routine. The PTC filed complaints. The FCC received them and mostly declined to act. The show kept airing. The PTC filed more complaints. The cycle repeated. The show was too established and too profitable to be meaningfully threatened by the complaints, and the PTC's influence over broadcast content, while not entirely negligible, was limited enough that its attacks never produced the kind of results it sought. What is genuinely interesting about the regulatory history of Family Guy, beyond the sheer volume of complaints, is what it reveals about the contested nature of broadcast standards in American television. The FCC exists to regulate indecency in broadcasting, but the definitions of indecency are much narrower than many people assume. Content that is offensive, tasteless, or morally objectionable is not automatically indecent in the legal sense. The legal definition involves very specific criteria about explicitness and context, and Family Guy, for all the genuine offensiveness of much of its content, generally managed to stay on the legal side of the line that the FCC was equipped to enforce. This meant that the complaints against the show, however heartfelt, were largely symbolic. They expressed displeasure. They put the displeasure on record. They gave concerned viewers a formal mechanism for registering their objections, but they did not succeed in changing what aired or when. Family Guy kept running, kept generating content that infuriated its critics, and kept doing so with the implicit protection of a regulatory framework that was not equipped to stop it. The strange resolution to the PTC conflict came much later. McFarlane, in what appeared to be a genuine act of outreach rather than a publicity stunt, invited PTC President Tim Winter to either write an episode of Family Guy himself or designate writers of his choosing to do so. Winter was apparently taken aback by the offer. The two men met and apparently had conversations that neither side fully publicized. Whatever was said, the result was something that would have seemed impossible during the peak of the conflict. The PTC found things to admire in McFarlane's Orville. The hostility between them cooled into something that, if not warmth, was at least mutual acknowledgement that the other person was more complicated than the role they had been playing. It is a reminder that most conflicts, even ones that seem permanently entrenched, are between actual people who are capable of changing. The McFarlane-PTC conflict lasted for 20 years and generated thousands of formal complaints and some of the most colorful insults in the history of media criticism. And then it kind of ended, quietly, without any formal announcement, replaced by something more resembling reluctant respect. The FCC complaints never really stopped, of course. The show kept making content that generated them. But the intensity of the formal fight faded, and Family Guy continued to exist in that peculiar position it had always occupied, a show that a significant portion of America found genuinely objectionable, but that the regulatory framework was not equipped to silence. Section 7. When real life hit the show, the Boston Marathon, 9/11, and the problem of accidental prophecy. There is a specific kind of controversy that follows comedy shows when real-world events make their content suddenly, unexpectedly horrifying. It is different from the controversy generated by intentional boundary pushing. It is the controversy of coincidence, of a joke made in one context suddenly existing in a completely different one, where its original intent is irrelevant because the world has changed and the joke has changed with it. Family Guy experienced this kind of controversy several times over its long run, but the most dramatic and most disturbing example came in April 2013, in the immediate aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing. Let us set the scene carefully. On the 17th of March, 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy. The episode was the 15th episode of Season 11. Its content, like most Family Guy content, was a mixture of main plot and cutaway gags with little apparent connection between them. One of the cutaway gags depicted Peter Griffin claiming to have won the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the race and running over the runners. Another separate segment of the episode involved a plot point about a bombing. These two elements were not connected to each other in the episode. They were separate jokes in different parts of the show. On the 15th of April, 2013, less than a month after Turban Cowboy aired, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the real Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed and hundreds were injured. It was the most devastating terrorist attack on American soil since the 11th of September 2001, and it sent the country into a period of collective grief and terror. Within hours of the bombing, someone on the internet had taken those 2 unrelated scenes from Turban Cowboy and spliced them together to create a video that appeared to show Family Guy predicting or even celebrating the attack. The editing was deliberate and sophisticated enough to fool people who weren't aware that the original scenes were separate. The video went viral. Conspiracy theorists, including Alex Jones, began circulating it as evidence of some form of advanced knowledge. The suggestion that Family Guy had somehow foreseen or encoded a message about the Boston Marathon bombing began spreading across social media with remarkable speed. Seth MacFarlane responded on Twitter with the specific precision of someone who was simultaneously devastated by the attack and furious about the video being circulated. He called the edited clip abhorrent, stated clearly that the event was a crime and a tragedy, and expressed his thoughts for the victims. Fox moved immediately to pull the Turban Cowboy episode from all streaming platforms, including Hulu and Fox.com, and stated that the network had no plans to re-air it. They also worked with YouTube to have the edited conspiracy clip removed. The situation was extraordinary for several reasons. A joke written months earlier about Peter driving through a marathon had become, through the coincidence of timing and the malice of a careful editor, something that looked like a prediction of mass murder. A show that had been generating controversy through intentional boundary pushing was now at the center of a controversy that had nothing to do with intent, only with terrible coincidence. And the conspiracy community had moved with remarkable speed to transform a comedic coincidence into a sinister narrative. MacFarlane's response was unequivocal and appropriate. He condemned the editing, expressed genuine solidarity with the victims, and did not attempt to defend the original episode by pointing out that the scenes had been taken out of context because the moment called for something more important than self-defense. The episode was pulled and has remained difficult to find through official channels ever since. The Turban Cowboy controversy was the most dramatic example of real-world events intersecting catastrophically with Family Guy's content, but it was not the only one. After the September 11th attacks, the cutaway gag involving Stewie and airport security and the reference to Osama bin Laden was edited out of reruns and removed from the first season DVD. The joke, which had been absurdist in its original context, was now impossible to read without thinking of the attacks, and the decision to remove it was one of the least controversial things the show ever did. There is something philosophically interesting about this kind of controversy, distinct from the controversy generated by intentional provocations. When the PTC files a complaint about Family Guy, the show's response can be, "We meant to do that, it served a comedic purpose, you are wrong to find it offensive." The show has a position it can defend. But when a joke from one context gets spliced into footage of a real terrorist attack, there is no defense available, because the controversy is not about what the show intended. It is about what the joke looks like in the world as it now exists. The show did not predict the Boston Marathon bombing. The editing was deliberate manipulation, but the image of Peter driving through marathon runners still exists, and the real bombing still happened, and once those two things have been placed in the same mental space, they cannot be fully separated again. This is the vulnerability of topical comedy, of jokes that touch on real things and real places and real events. When those real things change, the jokes change with them, regardless of what the writers intended. Family Guy, which had always been willing to make jokes about real places and real people and real situations, was exposed to this vulnerability repeatedly across its run. The Boston Marathon episode was the most dramatic example. It was also, in some ways, the most honest demonstration of the kind of collateral damage that aggressive, boundary-pushing comedy can generate even when it has no malicious intent. The show's handling of September 11th material was more sustained and more complicated. Over the years, various references to the attacks were made on the show, and each one generated its own controversy. The decision to edit the Bin Laden airport gag from Season 1 set a precedent for how the show would handle content that had been made more sensitive by real events, and it was generally handled with more care than the show's critics would have expected. MacFarlane's personal connection to the events, having missed a flight on one of the hijacked planes, gave him a specific relationship to that material that made it different from the show's treatment of most controversial topics. The relationship between comedy and tragedy is always complicated, and Family Guy spent its entire run navigating that relationship in a way that sometimes worked and sometimes failed badly. The Boston Marathon controversy was the failure version, a moment when the show's habit of finding humor in dark material collided with a real and devastating event in a way that was genuinely painful for a city and a nation that was already in pain. The show responded appropriately, but the image was already out there, and appropriateness after the fact cannot fully undo the damage done by unfortunate timing. Section 8. Celebrity sparring, the Sarah Palin affair, political jokes, and everyone who ever got mad at being referenced. Family Guy's approach to political and celebrity humor has always been aggressive. The show was never particularly interested in protecting reputations or treating public figures with unearned delicacy. MacFarlane's own political views are clearly liberal, and the show's political humor has historically reflected those views, which generated its own category of complaint from viewers who felt that the show was using its platform to prosecute political grievances under the cover of comedy. The most explosive celebrity-related controversy in the show's history came in February 2010, when Season 8, Episode 12, titled Extra Large Medium, aired on Valentine's Day. The episode included a storyline in which Chris Griffin asks out a girl named Ellen who has Down syndrome. On their date, Ellen mentions casually that her mother is the former governor of Alaska. This was a direct reference to Sarah Palin, who had indeed been the governor of Alaska and whose son Trig had Down syndrome. The joke was pointed on two levels. It used a character with Down syndrome to reference Palin, and it put specific dialogue in that character's mouth that was clearly meant as satirical commentary on Palin's public persona. The episode had been written and produced during a period when Palin was one of the most visible and divisive figures in American politics, having been the Republican vice presidential candidate in 2008, and the reference was not subtle. Palin's response was swift and public. She went on Fox News to condemn the episode and express what she described as her hurt and anger at the portrayal. She argued that the show was mocking her son Trig by depicting a Down syndrome character in a negative light, and she accused the show's creators of being heartless and using disability as a vehicle for political attacks. Palin's statement generated enormous media coverage, partly because she was a significant political figure, and partly because the argument itself was complex enough to resist easy resolution. The situation then took a genuinely unexpected turn. Andrea Faye Friedman, the actress who had provided the voice for Ellen in the episode, publicly responded to Palin's criticism. Friedman, who herself has Down syndrome and had been working as an actress for 18 years, wrote a letter to the New York Times pushing back against Palin's characterization. She argued that she thought the line about being the daughter of the former governor of Alaska was funny, that she understood it as sarcasm, and that in her family they believed laughing was good. She then made the pointed observation that her mother did not carry her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread, the way former Governor Palin carries her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes. The specific person Palin had claimed to be defending had publicly disagreed with her defense. Friedman's response undercut the simplest version of Palin's argument, which was that the episode was inherently degrading to people with Down syndrome. Friedman, who was herself a person with Down syndrome, did not feel degraded. She felt that Palin lacked a sense of humor, which is a different complaint entirely. MacFarlane's response to the controversy was interesting. He later said that he thought Palin's criticism was actually fair, not necessarily that the joke should not have been made, but that he understood why it hurt, and that Palin's reaction was a reasonable one for a mother whose child has been diagnosed with a condition that is sometimes used carelessly in comedy. He was willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of her upset even while defending the episode's satirical intent. This was one of the more genuinely thoughtful responses MacFarlane gave to any controversy, and it stood in contrast to his more confrontational approach with groups like the PTC. The show's international controversies extended beyond Venezuela's marijuana episode protest. In the 2020s, Family Guy's content became a point of tension with Russia in a manner that was genuinely novel. A two-part finale from Season 21, From Russia with Love and Adult Education, included a storyline that involved Brian having a social media profile, references to Russian interference in American culture, and content that Russian authorities found objectionable enough to issue formal warnings to cable stations broadcasting the show. The potential for Russia to ban Family Guy entirely over these episodes created a brief period of international attention in the broader, ongoing story of American-Russian cultural friction. The Russia situation was interesting precisely because it was not about the show's usual transgressive content. It was not about sex or drug use or disability jokes. It was about geopolitics and the specific cultural moment in which it aired, the period of heightened tension between the United States and Russia over Ukraine and other matters. Family Guy had, by this point in its run, become reflexively political enough that its political content was having consequences in diplomatic contexts. A cartoon about a Rhode Island family was generating formal warnings from foreign governments not because of shock humor but because of its engagement with real international tensions. This placed the show in a category alongside South Park, which has generated international diplomatic incidents on multiple occasions through its willingness to depict political figures and sensitive geopolitical situations with no particular concern for how the subjects of those depictions might react. The difference is that South Park creates those situations intentionally, as a formal artistic strategy. Family Guy in its later seasons often stumbled into them through a combination of topical awareness and reflexive provocation, without the same level of deliberate craft. The show's relationship with real political figures across its entire run would require its own extended documentary to fully account for. Presidents have been parodied extensively: vice presidents, governors, congressional figures, religious leaders, cultural icons, corporate executives. The depiction of all of these figures generated complaints from various quarters at various times, and the show's defense was always essentially the same. This is satire, and satire in a democracy requires the freedom to depict public figures in unflattering ways. This defense is legally sound and philosophically defensible. It is also sometimes used to cover content that does not quite rise to the level of genuine satire and is more accurately described as mean-spirited depiction dressed in satire's clothes. The show did both, and the quality of the distinction varied by episode. The Sarah Palin controversy is a useful example of how Family Guy's political humor worked and why it generated the specific complaints it did. The show had a political point of view, and that point of view expressed itself through the humor. Jokes about Palin were not purely satirical in the neutral sense. They came from a particular ideological position, and people who did not share that position found them offensive in a way that went beyond mere taste. There is a difference between finding a joke distasteful and finding it politically motivated, and Family Guy's critics in the political realm often experienced its humor as both simultaneously. Over the years, the show made jokes about practically every political figure and ideological position imaginable, but the jokes about conservative figures were generally sharper and more frequent than the jokes about liberal ones. This asymmetry was noticed and criticized by viewers who felt that a show claiming to be an equal opportunity offender was actually running a fairly consistent political agenda under the guise of comedy. The criticism was not entirely unfair. Brian Griffin's liberal politics had always been presented more sympathetically than any other character's political views. The show's targets tended to cluster on one end of the political spectrum more than the other. To be fair, the show did occasionally turn its satirical lens on liberal targets and sacred cows. The episode where Brian supports marijuana legalization, 420, was not exactly a fawning portrayal of progressive politics, given that Brian's advocacy came with all his usual pomposity intact. And the show was willing to make jokes about Democratic political figures, though perhaps not with the same frequency or ferocity as it directed at Republicans. But the perception that Family Guy was a liberal show using its platform to mock conservative figures was widespread enough to constitute its own category of complaint, separate from the PTC's moral objections and the broader concerns about content. This perception became more acute as the Brian character became more explicitly political, and as the show's willingness to make jokes about specific real-world controversies increased in the later seasons. The Palin episode was not the only celebrity controversy the show generated. Over the years, various public figures threatened or initiated legal action over how they were depicted on the show. The show depicted real people in fictional scenarios, which is generally permitted under First Amendment protections for satire. But the line between protected satire and actionable defamation is not always obvious, and the show sometimes operated very close to that line. Several episodes were modified or had content removed after legal complaints from the individuals depicted. The celebrity controversy history of Family Guy is long and varied enough to fill its own entire video, but what runs through all of it is a consistent willingness on the show's part to use real people and real public figures as comedic material in ways that the people involved often found objectionable. Sometimes the objections were frivolous. Sometimes they were entirely justified. The show's attitude toward these objections was generally one of indifference, not because the creators didn't care about the people they depicted, but because the logic of the show's humor required a willingness to go places that would upset someone. Section 9. The South Park feud, the cartoon wars that never really ended. The relationship between Family Guy and South Park represents one of the most sustained and publicly visible creative feuds in the history of American animated television. It has its own mythology, its own defining moments, and its own strange resolution that never quite resolved anything. It is also, in retrospect, one of the most fascinating documents of how different creative philosophies can coexist in the same medium and produce genuinely different kinds of comedy while maintaining a relationship of deep mutual antagonism. South Park premiered in August 1997, almost 2 years before Family Guy debuted. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were already established as figures in adult animation when McFarlane was still a young animator at Hanna-Barbera. The two shows have surface-level similarities. Both were adult animated comedies about suburban characters set in fictional American towns. Both dealt in crude humor and controversial subject matter, and both became cultural phenomena in the early 2000s. These surface similarities were enough for casual observers to lump them together, and it was exactly this lumping together that Parker and Stone resented. Parker and Stone's fundamental objection to Family Guy was, at its core, a creative objection. They felt that Family Guy's reliance on cutaway gags represented a fundamentally lazy approach to comedy. Their argument, articulated many times in various interviews and most memorably on a DVD commentary track, was that a good joke should emerge from character, situation, and story. It should be the result of something specific happening to specific people with specific motivations. A joke that exists as a free-floating reference, unconnected to anything that was happening in the narrative, was, in their view, not really a joke at all. It was a reference, and references are not jokes. This is a genuine creative argument with real substance behind it. South Park's comedy, at its best, emerges from its characters and their specific situations. The jokes are context-dependent in a way that makes them inseparable from the story containing them. This is a meaningfully different approach from Family Guy's cutaway model, where the humor is designed to be portable and context-free, capable of being extracted from its episode and existing independently as a 30-second clip. Both approaches have produced great comedy. They are genuinely different comedic philosophies, and neither one is inherently superior. But Parker and Stone's dislike of Family Guy went beyond this creative disagreement into something more personal. They felt that Family Guy was being compared to South Park in a way that was unfair to both shows, and they responded to that comparison by making their contempt for Family Guy public and formal. In April 2006, South Park aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The episodes told the story of an upcoming Family Guy episode that would depict the Prophet Muhammad as a character, causing panic in the town of South Park. But the real target of the episodes was Family Guy's creative approach. In the second part, Eric Cartman visits the Family Guy studio and discovers that the show's writing is done not by human writers but by manatees, aquatic mammals who push large balls called idea balls into a tank to generate the show's random, unconnected jokes. The suggestion was unambiguous. Family Guy's humor requires no creativity, no craft, no human intelligence. It is the product of random selection by animals. Parker and Stone received an enormous response to Cartoon Wars from other people in the animation industry. According to their own accounts, The writers at The Simpsons sent flowers. The writers at King of the Hill called to say they were doing God's work. Parker noted in an interview that The Simpsons writers actually hate Family Guy more than we do, even though they won't say it publicly. The sense that Family Guy was broadly resented by the animation community rather than celebrated was something that both shows were happy to have established. McFarlane's response to Cartoon Wars was revealing. He had initially developed a return shot, a joke aimed at Parker and Stone, but he ultimately decided not to include it in an episode, making the choice to absorb the criticism rather than escalate the war into a back and forth. This was, from a strategic standpoint, probably the right call. Cartoon Wars was so well executed and so widely praised that any response would have risked looking defensive. By not responding directly, McFarlane avoided giving the appearance that he had been hurt by the attack. But the sting of Cartoon Wars was real, and its argument was difficult to dismiss entirely. The manatee metaphor was effective precisely because there was something to it. Family Guy's cutaway gags were, by design, disconnected from the narratives they interrupted. The show's own creators had acknowledged this structure was intentional. The question was whether that disconnection was a feature or a flaw, whether producing portable, viral, context-independent humor was a legitimate creative choice or a symptom of laziness. Parker and Stone believed the latter. McFarlane believed the former. The show's response to Cartoon Wars within the actual episodes of Family Guy was characteristically oblique. In the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode of Family Guy, and while there, they observe the original characters standing around awkwardly during a cutaway, just waiting in silence for it to finish. It is a funny meta moment that accidentally, or perhaps entirely deliberately, illustrates the exact critique that Parker and Stone had been making. The characters have nothing to do during the cutaways except exist as placeholders. The joke is not theirs. They are just waiting for it to be over. The show was acknowledging the structure of its own humor in a way that nodded to Cartoon Wars without directly engaging with it, which was very Family Guy. The feud never fully ended. Parker and Stone restated their criticisms in various interviews over the years. In 2019, they gave an interview reiterating that they still hate Family Guy and still don't respect it in terms of writing. This was 13 years after Cartoon Wars, and they had not softened. The show had continued for all that time, had continued in the direction they had criticized, and they had continued to find it objectionable. What is remarkable about the South Park Family Guy conflict is how much it illuminates about the different things that animated comedy can do and be. South Park, at its best, is a show about ideas. It constructs elaborate satirical arguments through narrative. The humor is inseparable from the critique. Family Guy, at its best, is a show about moments. It creates compact, self-contained comedy that exists independently of its context. These are both legitimate approaches. They produce different kinds of entertainment for different kinds of audiences. The argument that one approach is inherently more respectable than the other is ultimately a taste argument dressed as a craft argument. Parker and Stone presented their preference for narrative-driven humor as though it were an objective standard of quality. McFarlane presented his preference for portable, gag-driven humor as an equally valid comedic philosophy. Both men were right about what their own shows were doing well, and both men were partly right about the weaknesses of the other. The lasting impact of Cartoon Wars on Family Guy's legacy is significant. The manatee metaphor stuck. It became the shorthand that critics used when discussing the show's approach to comedy. Even people who had never seen Cartoon Wars and didn't know where the reference came from would describe Family Guy as feeling random, like the jokes had been selected without any coherent principle. Parker and Stone had given the show's critics a vocabulary that persisted long after the original feud had quieted. McFarlane, in an interview given in 2025, expressed genuine admiration for South Park and for Parker and Stone's continued day-to-day involvement in their show. He praised their ability to respond to current events almost in real time, their consistency of creative involvement. It was a generous comment, made many years after the conflict had peaked, and it suggested that whatever animosity had existed between the two camps had mellowed, if not entirely disappeared, into something more like professional respect. The feud between Family Guy and South Park is, in the end, a story about two different visions of what adult animated comedy can be, conducted publicly and often ungenerously over a period of nearly 20 years. Neither show destroyed the other. Both continued. Both produced memorable episodes and embarrassing ones. And the argument they were having about craft and laziness and what makes a joke was real and worth having, even if the terms of the debate were sometimes less generous than the substance deserved. Section 10. The Creator and the Network. Seth MacFarlane vs. Fox, a slow-motion divorce. Of all the controversies surrounding Family Guy, the most structurally significant and the most underappreciated is the one that played out not in public through press releases and Twitter battles, but quietly through contract negotiations and television scheduling decisions and a creeping sense of institutional alienation. The story of Seth MacFarlane's deteriorating relationship with Fox is not the most dramatic controversy in Family Guy's history, but it may be the most consequential because it describes a creator becoming emotionally and creatively detached from his own creation, which is one of the most reliable ways for a long-running show to decline. MacFarlane's early relationship with Fox was, by necessity, close. The network had made him. They had taken his pitch in 1998, given him the resources to make the show, and launched it in the best possible time slot. When Fox canceled Family Guy after its third season, MacFarlane was clearly frustrated, but the show came back and the relationship continued. He was one of the most valuable creative assets on the Fox roster, producing Family Guy, American Dad, and eventually The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. He was voicing 4 major characters on Family Guy alone. He was everywhere in the network's animated lineup. But as the years went on, the relationship began to chafe. MacFarlane's political views, which were consistently and publicly liberal, put him in an increasingly uncomfortable position at a network that shared branding and corporate history with Fox News. The Murdoch media empire was a single entity in the public imagination, even if the actual networks operated with some degree of editorial independence, and MacFarlane was increasingly uncomfortable being associated with it. The discomfort became public in 2018, when Fox News host Tucker Carlson told his viewers to always assume the opposite of whatever they're told on mainstream news networks. MacFarlane posted a response that included the phrase, "I am embarrassed to work for this company." This was not a private complaint or an off-the-record comment to a journalist. This was the creator of one of Fox's flagship shows, publicly, on social media, expressing embarrassment about his association with the network. It was an extraordinary thing to say publicly, and it reflected how strained the relationship had become. The embarrassment post was later deleted, but the sentiment persisted. In 2020, MacFarlane made a major strategic move, signing a 5-year deal with NBC Universal reportedly worth around $200 million, which moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, out of the Fox ecosystem and into the Comcast family of networks. His new projects, including the continuation of The Orville, the Ted prequel series for Peacock, and other development deals, were all happening at places that had nothing to do with Fox. MacFarlane was building his future elsewhere. Then, in August 2021, after Tucker Carlson made what MacFarlane considered particularly objectionable commentary, MacFarlane posted one of the most memorable social media messages of his career. The full text read, "Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again makes me wish Family Guy was on any other network. Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore. The sex is only once a year. I don't get along with your mother, and well, I've been having an affair with NBC." The affair with NBC was a reference to the NBC Universal deal. The marriage metaphor was pointed and specific. He was using the language of a failing marriage to describe his relationship with the network that aired his most famous show, and he was doing it publicly, for everyone to read. This was a level of creator-network friction that almost never plays out in public. Usually, when creators have problems with their networks, those problems get managed through representatives and negotiations and carefully worded statements from publicists. MacFarlane was posting about it on Twitter using marriage metaphors. The level of public frankness was itself remarkable, and it said something important about how little MacFarlane had left to lose in his relationship with Fox, or how little he cared about managing the appearance of that relationship. The contrast between this MacFarlane and the MacFarlane who had pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998 with enormous enthusiasm is stark. The young creator who had built this world out of his own imagination and who had fought to bring it back after cancellation had become, 20 years later, a man who was publicly describing his relationship with the network airing his show as a failing marriage. The passion was gone. What remained was obligation and economics. MacFarlane continued voicing his characters, He did not walk away from Family Guy. The economics of the situation made walking away complicated, and he had expressed publicly that the show continued to generate revenue that he directed toward causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. Family Guy was, by 2020, less a creative passion project and more a reliable income stream that happened to require him to sit in a recording booth a certain number of days per year. The specific timeline of MacFarlane's creative withdrawal is worth tracing carefully, because it maps fairly closely onto the quality curve of the show. During the first 3 seasons, MacFarlane's creative involvement was total. He was writing, directing in spirit, voicing characters, shaping the tone of every episode. The cancellation and revival disrupted this, and by the time the show came back in Season 4, some dilution had already occurred through the necessity of rebuilding the writing staff. But MacFarlane was still deeply involved through roughly Season 7 or 8, still functioning as the creative center of gravity around which the show orbited. Around 2011, when he began working seriously on his first feature film, Ted, his active involvement in Family Guy's creative decisions diminished substantially. Ted became a massive global success, earning over $500 million worldwide and establishing MacFarlane as a genuine feature film director rather than simply an animation creator. The success of Ted opened doors that required his time and his attention. A sequel, a Western comedy called A Million Ways to Die in the West, development of The Orville, which premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu. Each new project took him further from the day-to-day work of making Family Guy. The showrunners who managed the show in his absence, Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, were experienced and competent television professionals. They had been part of the Family Guy world for years. But there is a specific knowledge that comes from being the person who created a thing, a sense of what is true to the spirit of that thing that cannot be fully transferred to someone else through notes or executive producer credits. The showrunners knew Family Guy. They did not have MacFarlane's specific instinct for what Family Guy was supposed to be, because that instinct lived inside the person who had constructed the characters from scratch. This is not a criticism of Appel and Sulkin specifically. It is an observation about creative inheritance generally. The person who builds a house knows things about how it was put together that the person who buys it later cannot fully know without tearing it apart. The new owners can maintain it, extend it, renovate it. But there will always be things they misunderstand about how the original builder made decisions, and those misunderstandings will show in the work over time. In April 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview discussing the show's future. He said he did not see a compelling reason to stop making it, because people still loved it and it made them happy, and it helped fund causes that mattered to him. He said the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going long enough that there was no obvious endpoint. He framed the show's continuation in terms of financial utility and audience demand. There was no mention of creative ambition or stories he wanted to tell or characters he was excited to develop further. This is not the framing of someone who is deeply emotionally invested in the work. It is the framing of someone who has made peace with something becoming a business that continues to operate, rather than a piece of art that continues to grow. And when the person who created something thinks of it primarily as a business operation, that business operation will eventually feel like a business operation to the people consuming it. Then, in April 2025, Family Guy was renewed for 4 more seasons as part of what Fox and Disney called a Meganimation deal, alongside The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and the returning American Dad. The deal would take Family Guy through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each of the new seasons would consist of 15 episodes rather than the traditional longer orders. The show was not just surviving, it was being guaranteed years of additional existence. MacFarlane's public response to the renewal was measured. He expressed that he was glad the people who worked on the show had security, that there were writers and artists and voice actors whose livelihoods depended on it continuing, and that the audience for the show was still there. These are all true things. They are also not the words of someone who is creatively excited about what comes next. The MacFarlane-Fox situation illuminates something important about what happens to long-running television shows when the creative center of gravity shifts. Family Guy has had capable showrunners managing its day-to-day operations for years. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin have been stewards of the show through its middle and later seasons. They know the show's world. They know the characters. They have kept the machine running. But there is a difference between knowing a show and having the specific vision that created it, the instinctive sense of what the show is supposed to be and when it is drifting away from that. MacFarlane had that sense during the early seasons. When he stepped back from active creative involvement, that instinctive quality control stepped back with him. The show did not become unwatchable the day MacFarlane reduced his involvement. The decline was gradual, a slow drift rather than a sudden fall. But looking at the show's trajectory from its peak in the first few seasons, through its long middle period, and into its present state, the correlation between MacFarlane's reduced creative involvement and the quality decline is difficult to ignore. He was the filter through which the show's excesses were moderated. Without that filter, the show was free to become the version of itself that he might have recognized but not necessarily have chosen. The great irony of the MacFarlane-Fox relationship is that the show he created, which he grew to be embarrassed to have associated with a particular network, kept that network from having any choice but to keep airing it. Family Guy is too valuable as a property, too reliable as a business, too established as a brand, for either the creator or the network to walk away from it. They are stuck together the way MacFarlane described in his 2021 tweet. The marriage isn't working, but they can't get divorced because the assets are too entangled. Section 11. Shock value and smart writing. The long drift toward extremity. There is a fundamental distinction, easy to describe and hard to maintain, between dark humor and shock value. Dark humor finds something genuinely funny in difficult or taboo subject matter. It uses the darkness to illuminate, to puncture pretension, to say something true about the human condition through the vehicle of transgression. Shock value simply presents something extreme and waits for the audience to react. The presentation of the extreme thing is the entire point. There is no observation beneath it, no wit embedded in it, no truth hiding behind the transgression. There is just the thing itself, and whatever reaction it provokes. Family Guy spent its early years firmly in the dark humor category. The jokes in seasons 1 through 3 were genuinely clever. They pushed against taboos, certainly, but they did so with a specific kind of intelligence that made the boundary-pushing feel purposeful. The show was not just doing things to shock people, it was using shock as the delivery mechanism for something sharper, something that made you laugh because it was also making you think. By the time the show reached its middle seasons, particularly seasons 8 through 12, the balance had shifted significantly. The clever dark humor was still present sometimes, still capable of producing the specific pleasure of being surprised by a joke that knew exactly what it was doing. But alongside it, increasingly, was a different kind of content. Shock for its own sake, graphic violence played for laughs without any additional layer beneath it, gross-out humor that had no punchline beyond its own grossness, deliberately offensive content that was not satirizing anything. The graphic violence is the clearest example of this shift. In the early seasons, Family Guy had cartoon violence that was silly and exaggerated in the way that all animated comedies use physical humor. Characters bounced back from things that would be fatal in reality. The fights between Peter and the giant chicken, which became a recurring bit in later seasons, were originally funny because they escalated to absurd extremes while maintaining a certain cartoon lightness. You watch them the way you watch a Looney Tunes short, knowing that nothing you are seeing could ever really happen, which is what makes it funny. By the later seasons, the violence had become significantly more graphic. Characters were depicted with injuries detailed enough to cause genuine discomfort, exposed brains, dangling eyeballs, chainsaw wounds, people being crushed in ways that were anatomically plausible rather than cartoonishly impossible. The show was moving from cartoon violence into something closer to illustrated violence, and the humor, such as it was, came not from the absurdity but from the extremity of the depiction. This shift generated its own category of complaint. The PTC, which had always criticized the show's sexual and political content, added visceral, violent content to the list of objections. And viewers who had been longtime fans of the show began expressing that they no longer found it comfortable to watch, that something about the tone of the violence had crossed from playful into something harder to dismiss. The gross-out humor underwent a similar escalation. The show had always included content that was designed to be repulsive as well as funny. In the early seasons, these moments were brief and usually had a comedic point. The horse semen cereal scene from Family Guy, which generated 188,000 FCC complaints, is an example of gross-out humor that actually has a comedic structure behind it. The setup involves a misunderstanding, The reveal is specific, and Stewie's reaction provides the punchline. It is genuinely disgusting, but it is also constructed with some care. By the later seasons, scenes involving bodily functions, medical procedures depicted in graphic detail, and other viscerally unpleasant content had become increasingly common and increasingly unmoored from any comedic structure. The grossness was becoming the point rather than the vehicle for a point. And gross content that exists only to be gross is, for most audiences, simply unpleasant rather than funny. The show's approach to sensitive social topics also underwent a transformation that critics noted with increasing frequency. The early Family Guy tackled difficult subjects with a degree of craft. The jokes about race, gender, disability, and social class were written with enough intelligence that the offense was embedded in something more complex. You might be uncomfortable with the joke, but you could usually see what it was reaching for. By the later seasons, the sophistication had largely drained away. The jokes on sensitive subjects became blunter, less constructed, more likely to consist of simply pointing at the sensitive thing and calling attention to it. This is the difference between satire and mockery, a real and meaningful distinction. Satire uses the subject matter to say something true. Mockery just identifies a target and points. Family Guy had always done some of both, but the ratio shifted dramatically toward mockery in the middle and later seasons. The season 10 episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q., which aired in October 2011, generated its own separate controversy distinct from any other single episode the show produced. The episode attempted something unusual for Family Guy, a serious, dramatic exploration of domestic violence centered on Quagmire's sister Brenda, who was in an abusive relationship with a man named Jeff. The episode was not played primarily for comedy. It depicted the abuse with something approaching realism. Jeff hitting Brenda, the psychological hold he had over her, her refusal to believe she deserved better. Quagmire, along with Peter and Joe, eventually took matters into their own hands by murdering Jeff. The controversy around Screams of Silence was different from the standard Family Guy controversy, which usually involved the PTC objecting to indecent content. The objections to this episode came from domestic violence advocates and organizations, who argued that the episode, despite its serious intentions, actually did real harm by mocking the victim rather than truly depicting her experience with empathy. Domestic violence experts who reviewed the episode noted that Brenda was portrayed as too stupid or too weak to make the obvious choice to leave, which they felt reproduced a harmful stereotype about why abuse victims stay in abusive relationships. The reality of why people stay in abusive relationships is complicated and involves factors like financial dependency, fear of escalation, psychological manipulation by the abuser, and lack of safe exit options. The episode flattened this complexity into something that read as the victim simply lacking good judgment. CNN's Showbiz Tonight covered the controversy specifically, with commentators noting that the episode made fun of the victim more than the abuser, and that the main message of the episode appeared to be that this poor, stupid woman was too dumb to leave her relationship. This was a significant criticism because it came not from a conservative watchdog group, but from advocates for a vulnerable population, and it pointed to a genuine problem with how the episode handled its serious subject matter. The show's attempt at a serious, dramatic episode was, in many ways, well-intentioned. The subject of domestic violence deserved to be addressed with some gravity. The problem was that Family Guy's comedic infrastructure, its characters, its tone, its relationship to consequences, was not designed to handle genuinely heavy, dramatic material. The show was built on the principle that consequences are temporary and characters reset. Domestic violence is about consequences that are permanent and patterns that repeat. The show's format was fundamentally incompatible with the subject it was trying to address, and the result was something that satisfied neither the comedy audience nor the serious topic audience. The episode became a specific reference point in discussions about comedy and sensitive subjects, about what it means for a show to tackle something difficult, and whether the attempt to tackle it is sufficient, or whether the execution determines the value of the attempt. Family Guy tried to do something meaningful with Screams of Silence. It did not succeed, and the failure was not incidental. It emerged from the specific limitations of what the show had become by that point in its run. The political humor followed the same trajectory. In the early seasons, the show's political jokes were generally embedded in situations and characters. By the later seasons, entire episodes were organized around political topics in ways that felt like position papers written in cartoon form. The humor had become a delivery mechanism for ideology rather than the other way around. Brian Griffin, as the show's primary political mouthpiece, was at the center of this, giving speeches that did not emerge naturally from the character or situation, but were clearly the writers saying things they wanted said through a convenient vessel. There is a version of this that can work. The Simpsons has always had political opinions, and when they are expressed through well-developed characters in well-constructed situations, they are genuinely funny and often genuinely insightful. The difference is that The Simpsons built its political moments from character outward. Family Guy, in its later seasons, built its political moments from message outward. The message was decided first, and then Brian was sent to deliver it, which meant that the message usually landed with less force because the character delivering it had become less believable as a person. Fourth wall breaking became another element of the later seasons that divided audiences. Family Guy's characters began to directly address the audience with increasing frequency, to reference the show's own long run and declining quality, to make jokes about being on Fox or about the writing room or about the fact that the show had been on too long. Some of this was genuinely funny. The meta-awareness of a show that knows what it has become can be its own kind of comedy, but there is a limit to how far this can go before it stops being self-aware and starts being an excuse. If you make enough jokes about your own declining quality, you begin to feel like you're using the self-deprecation as a substitute for actually doing better. The jokes that say we know this show isn't as good as it was are not the same as the episodes that prove the show can still be great. They are, at worst, a form of preemptive surrender, acknowledging the problem without doing anything about it. The Conway Twitty gag is the episode-specific example of lazy writing that critics most frequently cite, and it deserves some time because it is genuinely illuminating. Conway Twitty was a country music singer who died in 1993. Starting in Season 4 and continuing across multiple seasons, Family Guy developed a recurring bit in which, instead of an actual joke, the show would cut to a full-length performance of a Conway Twitty song. Not a brief clip, not a passing reference. A complete unedited musical performance that had nothing to do with anything in the episode. The first time it appeared, there was something audacious and slightly funny about the confidence of it. The willingness to simply replace comedy with a country song and let it run. By the second and third and fourth time it appeared, the audacity had evaporated and what remained was transparent. The show did not have enough material to fill the episode. A Conway Twitty song takes the same amount of screen time as an actual scene. The song was a placeholder, and everyone watching knew it. The Conway Twitty bit became the shorthand that fans used when describing what had gone wrong with the show's sense of craft. It was pointed to in online discussions as the moment when the gap between what Family Guy was willing to do to fill time and what the audience deserved became impossible to ignore, and it was made more uncomfortable by the show's own apparent awareness of the joke's emptiness. In later seasons, the Conway Twitty bit was sometimes played with a meta-awareness, acknowledging that the audience knew it was a filler device. But meta-awareness of a bad habit is not the same as fixing it. You can laugh about your own procrastination and still procrastinate. The related pattern of extending physical gags beyond any comedic justification is worth addressing directly. In the early seasons, if Peter fell or hit something or got injured in the show's standard cartoon violence way, the gag would last a few seconds, make its point, move on. In the later seasons, the writers discovered that extending these moments added to the runtime without requiring additional creative work. A scene of Peter making a pained noise after hurting himself that would have lasted 5 seconds in Season 2 would last 45 seconds in Season 10. The same noise, repeated, the same expression, held. The comedy of endurance, which can be a real comedic technique, was being used not as a technique but as a production necessity. You could fill a lot of airtime that way. The show's best later episodes, and there were genuinely great ones, were mostly the ones that abandoned the shock for shock's sake model and committed fully to character and story. The Stewie Brian Vault episode from Season 8, in which the two characters spend an entire episode trapped together and talk honestly about their lives, is a masterpiece of intimate character study that has nothing in common with the formula the show defaulted to in most episodes. It proved that the writers were capable of the discipline and craft that the early seasons had demanded. It just didn't prove that they were willing to apply that discipline consistently. The most damning thing you can say about Family Guy's shift towards shock value is not that the shock content was offensive. Offensive content is not inherently bad comedy. It is that the shock content stopped being in service of anything. It existed for its own sake, and content that exists only for its own sake, without a deeper purpose or a more complex truth beneath it, has nowhere to go except toward greater extremity. Once the audience is numb to the current level of shock, the only way to get a reaction is to go further. The show went further, and eventually it ran into the problem that always awaits shows built on escalating transgression. There is always a limit, and once you've reached it, you've already lost your audience somewhere along the way. Section 12. The numbers tell the truth. Family Guy's ratings collapse and what it means. When a show generates controversy for 25 years, the controversy eventually becomes part of the furniture. People stop being surprised that Family Guy upset someone this week. The outrage normalizes. The complaints file themselves in their regulatory folders. The boycotts don't quite materialize. And the show keeps going. But ratings don't normalize. Ratings are data, and data doesn't care about context or justification or the complicated history of a show's relationship with its audience. The numbers are what they are. Family Guy's ratings history is one of the most dramatic decline stories in the history of American broadcast television. It did not happen overnight, and no single controversy can be held responsible for it. But looking at the arc from beginning to present is genuinely sobering. When the show premiered on the 31st of January 1999, following the Super Bowl, it drew approximately 22 million viewers. That is one of the largest audiences ever assembled for a new animated program. Yes, the Super Bowl bump inflated it. But even accounting for that, the first season averaged 8 million households tuning in each week, which was enough to rank the show at number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings for that television year. For a brand new adult animated comedy, those were excellent numbers. The scheduling chaos of seasons 2 and 3 killed those numbers before the show ever had a chance to find its natural audience. Fox moved the show 4 times in 2 seasons, pitting it against Frasier and then against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire at the peaks of those shows' popularity. By the time Fox canceled it after season 3 in 2002, the ratings had deteriorated badly, but through scheduling failures rather than audience rejection. When the show returned for season 4 in 2005, the revival drove a strong audience. The Adult Swim reruns had built a passionate fan base during the 3-year absence, and those fans showed up. Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers per episode, which was impressive for a returning show, and suggested that the original audience, plus a new generation of viewers who had discovered the show through reruns, was genuinely there. And then the slow decline began. Season by season, the numbers ticked downward. The decline was gradual enough in any single year to be explained away by other factors. Streaming was fragmenting the audience. DVR viewing was changing how people counted ratings. Competition in the time slot was getting stiffer. There was always something to point to besides the quality of the show itself. But zoom out far enough and the pattern is undeniable. By season 13, covering the 2014 to 2015 television year, the average viewership had dropped to 5.86 million. That is a loss of roughly 2 million viewers from the revival season's peak, over 9 seasons. Then the decline accelerated. Season 20 averaged just 1.31 million viewers, with a 0.45 rating in the key 18 to 49 demographic that advertisers care most about. Season 23 averaged approximately 723,000 viewers, with a 0.19 rating in that same demographic. Stand back from those numbers for a moment and let them register. A show that returned from cancellation in 2005 to 7.9 million viewers per episode was roughly 18 seasons later, drawing fewer than 750,000 viewers per episode. That is a loss of more than 90% of the audience. More than 9 out of every 10 people who were watching Family Guy in 2005 were no longer watching Family Guy by the show's 23rd season. The network's treatment of the show reflected this decline. For most of its run, Family Guy was a Sunday night institution, part of the animation domination block that Fox had built around it. Sunday nights on Fox were prime real estate, the home of the network's most valuable animated properties. Family Guy had been at 9 p.m. for years. In 2019, it was moved to the 9:30 slot. A small shift, but a meaningful one. Then came a more significant move. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy was removed from the Sunday night animation domination block entirely and relocated to Wednesday nights. This was the first time the show had aired on a weekday since 2002, during its troubled original run, when it was being shuffled from time slot to time slot before its first cancellation. Being moved from Sunday night, the most prestigious slot in Fox's animation lineup, to Wednesday night is, in television industry terms, a demotion. It is the network saying that this show is no longer one of our flagship properties. The Fox executives who spoke publicly about the Wednesday night move worked to frame it as an opportunity rather than a demotion. They talked about giving the show a no-repeat run where it could build audience consistency without the scheduling disruptions that come with Sunday night programming. They noted that the spring schedule gave the show a guaranteed clear path to air without competition from NFL football or other high-priority programming. These are not unreasonable arguments, but they are also the arguments that television executives always make when they move a long-running show to a less prominent slot, and the industry context of the move was clear enough that most observers read it correctly. The irony is almost perfectly circular. Family Guy's original cancellation in 2002 had been caused in no small part by Fox moving the show to Tuesday nights where it couldn't compete. The network's scheduling decisions had killed it the first time. 20 years later, the network's scheduling decisions were quietly signaling that its cultural moment had passed. The show that had been saved by fan passion and rerun ratings had become the show that the network was gently repositioning away from its most visible time slots, not canceling because the economics didn't require cancellation, but demoting because the cultural argument for keeping it at the center of Sunday night animation had eroded. The 2024 decision to hold Family Guy for mid-season, rather than including it in the fall lineup for the first time since 2005, was another signal in the same direction. Mid-season programming exists in the television calendar as a kind of holding pattern. Useful real estate, but not the showpiece position that network executives give their most valuable properties. Family Guy had been a fall premiere show for almost its entire revival run. The shift to mid-season was quiet and did not generate much press coverage, which was itself significant. In the years when Family Guy was at its cultural peak, a scheduling change of that magnitude would have been news. By 2024, it was largely a footnote. The streaming economics that kept the show viable in the face of declining broadcast viewership are worth examining briefly, because they are genuinely unusual. Family Guy has been streaming on Hulu in the United States for many years, and the arrangement between Hulu and Fox has been one of the more financially significant in the history of television streaming deals. The show's back catalog, hundreds of episodes spanning more than 2 decades, generates consistent streaming revenue that supplements and in some cases exceeds the value of the show's first-run broadcast numbers. A viewer who discovers Family Guy through Hulu and watches 3 seasons in a week is contributing to the show's financial viability in a way that traditional Nielsen ratings don't fully capture. This is the economic reality that allowed Fox and Disney to announce the 4-season renewal in April 2025 in terms that did not reference the show's declining traditional ratings. The Meganimation deal was about the total value of these brands across all platforms and all revenue streams, not about the number of people watching on Wednesday nights. The show's financial existence is genuinely complicated, involving broadcast, streaming, syndication, merchandise, and international licensing, and no single number fully describes it. What is true is that the show is still financially viable and will remain so for the foreseeable future. What is also true is that the cultural conversation around it has moved on in ways that financial viability doesn't reverse. The irony of Family Guy's scheduling history is almost poetic. The show was originally killed by bad scheduling decisions in its first run. It came back because the audience that had loved it found it on Adult Swim reruns and bought the DVDs and demanded its return. It was given a prime Sunday night home and became one of the biggest shows on the network. And then, 20 years later, the declining ratings put it back in the scheduling exile that had nearly destroyed it in 2002. Why did Fox keep renewing it despite the declining numbers? The answer is economic rather than creative. Animated shows are significantly cheaper to produce than live-action dramas or comedies. There are no expensive sets, no large on-screen cast demanding per-episode fees commensurate with their fame, no location shoots. The voice actors record their lines in booths. The animation is produced through digital pipelines. The whole operation is lean and cost-effective. When a show generates less than 1 million viewers per episode but costs very little to produce, the math can still work. Beyond production costs, Family Guy generates revenue from reruns, from streaming on Hulu, from merchandising, from syndication deals with cable networks including Adult Swim and Comedy Central, from international licensing, and from ancillary products. The value of the Family Guy brand is substantially larger than the value of its first-run viewership, which means that the declining ratings tell only part of the financial story. The April 2025 Meganimation deal, which renewed Family Guy through season 27 alongside The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and The Returning American Dad, was framed by Fox and Disney as a celebration of these shows' enduring value. And in a strictly business sense, that framing is accurate. The deal was not driven by the creative excellence of these shows in their current state. It was driven by the enormous cumulative value of decades of content, loyal global audiences, and stable production economics. But there is a difference between renewing a show because it is good and renewing a show because it is profitable and relatively cheap. Family Guy in 2025 exists for reasons that have almost nothing to do with why it was created in 1998. It exists because the economics of animation and the machinery of television licensing make its continued existence beneficial to multiple large corporations. McFarlane himself framed it in exactly these terms when discussing the renewal. The show continues because it can, and because its continuation serves purposes beyond the purely creative. This is not a condemnation exactly. Television is a business, and shows that continue beyond their creative prime are not unique to Family Guy. The Simpsons has been running for longer and has had its own extended period of quality decline. Many beloved shows have continued past the point where they were generating their best work. The economics of television make this inevitable, but the ratings collapse of Family Guy is a more extreme version of this story than most. The loss of more than 90% of the show's revival-era audience is a number that is difficult to contextualize in a way that makes it seem anything other than what it is. The audience telling the show, through the act of not watching it, that something had gone wrong. The viewers who are still watching Family Guy in its current form are doing so for reasons worth examining. Some of them are longtime fans who keep watching out of loyalty and habit. Some of them are new viewers who discovered the show through streaming and find its current form entertaining without the context of what it used to be. Some of them are simply fans of the format, people who enjoy the cutaway gag style regardless of the specific quality of any given episode. These are all legitimate reasons to watch a show. The argument could be made that the audience that remains is in some ways more engaged than the larger audience of the revival era, because they are still choosing to watch something they could easily stop watching. Loyalty under diminishing returns is its own kind of devotion. But the audience of 750,000 is a fundamentally different thing from the audience of nearly 8 million. It represents a show that has become a niche product rather than a cultural phenomenon. Family Guy, which, for a period in the mid-2000s, was one of the most discussed programs on American television, which inspired cartoon wars and FCC complaints and Venezuelan government warnings and nationally trending hashtags, has become a show that most people are simply not paying attention to anymore. The controversies keep happening. The FCC occasionally receives complaints. The critics occasionally note episodes that go too far in one direction or another. But the cultural weight of those controversies is smaller now than it was in the show's prime. When fewer people are watching, fewer people are outraged, and fewer people are defending the outrage against the critics. The show has become quieter, even in its controversy. Section 13. American Dad proved it didn't have to be this way. The silent counter-argument. Every time someone argues that Family Guy's quality decline was inevitable, that any show running for 25 years would eventually become a shadow of itself, that creative fatigue is an unavoidable consequence of longevity. The correct response is to point at American Dad and let it do the arguing. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned for its 4th season. It was created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed the Smith family in Langley Falls, Virginia, led by Stan Smith, a fiercely patriotic CIA agent, his wife Francine, their kids Haley and Steve, a space alien named Roger who lived in their attic and survived by adopting elaborate human personas, and a talking goldfish named Klaus, who was actually the brain of a former East German Olympic ski champion, transplanted into a fish's body by the CIA. The premise is genuinely strange, arguably stranger than Family Guy's, and in its first season it was not particularly good. Early American Dad leaned too heavily on Stan's political caricature. The show seemed to think that Stan being an extreme conservative was the entire joke, and it played that joke repeatedly without much variation. The ratings were decent but unspectacular. The critical reception was lukewarm. Fans of Family Guy watched it primarily because it aired right after Family Guy on Sunday nights, not because they were seeking it out. In 2005 and 2006, nobody was calling American Dad the better show. It was just there. And then it got better. Substantially, consistently, measurably better. The most significant creative decision that American Dad made, the one that separated it most clearly from Family Guy, was the decision not to use cutaway gags. This sounds like a small structural choice, but its implications reverberated through every episode the show produced. Without cutaways as a fallback, the writers of American Dad had to make every episode work as a complete story. There was nowhere to hide. If the main plot wasn't compelling, there was no sequence of random gags to rescue the episode. Every funny moment had to be earned through character and situation. This constraint made the writing better. The American Dad writers, freed from the option of filling time with disconnected gags, developed into genuinely sophisticated storytellers. Episodes had coherent structures. Characters' motivations were consistent and legible. The humor emerged from the situations these specific people were in, which meant the humor felt specific rather than interchangeable. The characters on American Dad also resisted the flanderization that destroyed the Family Guy cast. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional caricature and developed, over the show's run, into one of the most layered and funny characters in adult animation. He was wrong about a lot of things, and right about very few of them, but he loved his family with a genuine ferocity that the show never abandoned. He learned things, sometimes, and forgot them, but the learning felt natural rather than imposed, and the forgetting felt character-appropriate rather than lazy. Roger the Alien became a genuinely extraordinary comedic creation. His ability to adopt different personas, to become entirely different characters with different names and different histories and different relationships to the other characters, gave the writers essentially unlimited material. They could put a new version of Roger into any situation and find comedy in it, because each persona was a complete character rather than a variation on a single joke. The concept was designed for longevity in a way that Evil Baby Stewie was not, because it contained infinite variation from the beginning. The Smith family maintained a warmth toward each other that the Griffin family lost after the first few seasons. Stan and Francine's marriage, while depicted with all its flaws and tensions, was clearly a real marriage between two people who loved each other. The family dynamics had genuine emotional stakes because the relationships felt real. When the show did an episode about Stan and Francine having a serious problem, it mattered in a way that Family Guy's similar episodes increasingly did not. The fan and critical consensus about which show was better shifted over the years. By the middle of the 2010s, it had become almost a cliché in animation-focused discussions to note that American Dad had surpassed Family Guy. The show that was dismissed in 2005 as a lesser McFarlane creation had become the standard against which Family Guy was unfavorably compared. Reviews of Family Guy episodes routinely noted that American Dad would have handled the same premise better. Fan communities that had grown up on Family Guy were recommending American Dad as the show that still delivered what Family Guy used to. The Stan and Francine Smith relationship is worth examining in some detail because it does exactly what the Peter and Lois Griffin relationship stopped doing somewhere around season 8. Stan is wrong about a great many things. He is politically extreme in ways the show often mocks. He is frequently oblivious to the needs of the people around him, and will sometimes prioritize his own comfort or his patriotic worldview over his family's genuine well-being. In this respect, he shares certain structural features with Peter Griffin, but Stan's wrongness exists within a relationship that the show consistently treats as genuine. When Stan does something that harms Francine, the show takes the harm seriously. When they fight, the fight has real stakes because both of them are recognizable as people. Francine is not simply a foil for Stan's excesses. She has her own perspective, her own history, her own things she wants from life that are distinct from what Stan wants. She pushes back when she disagrees. She holds her ground. The marriage has the texture of an actual marriage between two actual people, even though one of them is a CIA agent who has hosted an alien in his attic for 2 decades. Compare this to Peter and Lois by season 10, where the marriage had become a backdrop against which Peter's behavior played out, with Lois serving primarily as the recipient of that behavior rather than a full participant in the relationship. The specificity and the mutuality that had characterized the early Lois and Peter dynamic had faded. replaced by something more mechanical, a husband who acts and a wife who reacts. The character of Haley Smith also demonstrates what good long-form character development looks like. Haley started as a generic, progressive, liberal foil to Stan's conservatism, the daughter who disagreed with her father about everything as a matter of principle. This was not a particularly complex setup, but over the seasons the show found actual complexity in Haley as a person. Her genuine passion for causes that sometimes led her to be self-righteous and hypocritical, her relationship with Jeff, her growth into something more nuanced than the protest sign she was initially defined by. Haley's evolution was gradual and felt earned, which is precisely what Peter's evolution was not. American Dad also handled its own network transitions more gracefully than Family Guy. The show moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season in 2014, and the move, which could have disrupted its audience and its creative momentum, ended up being a liberating change. The writers had more creative freedom at TBS. The show continued to evolve and improve. When the Disney-Fox Meganimation deal in 2025 brought American Dad back to Fox alongside Family Guy, The Simpsons, and Bob's Burgers, it was returning from TBS as arguably the strongest of the four. The American Dad comparison is damaging to the Family Guy story precisely because it eliminates the most comfortable excuse for Family Guy's decline. The creative fatigue argument holds that any show running long enough will eventually exhaust its creative reserves, that the quality decline is inevitable rather than the result of specific bad choices. American Dad, running for roughly the same amount of time, in roughly the same genre, produced by the same company and the same creator, demonstrates that this argument is not entirely true. Longevity doesn't doom a show. Specific choices doom a show. Family Guy chose cutaway dependency. American Dad chose storytelling. Family Guy chose to push its characters into extremity without consequences. American Dad chose to develop its characters while maintaining their essential natures. Family Guy chose shock and transgression as primary humor modes. American Dad chose to be funny through situation and character. At almost every significant creative decision point, the two shows went in different directions, and the results accumulated season by season into the difference between a show that continued to be great and a show that became a cautionary tale. The specific differences in how the two shows handled their writing rooms over the long term are worth noting. American Dad, particularly during the period when Matt Weitzman was the primary showrunner, maintained a consistency of creative vision that Family Guy lacked. The show had a clearer sense of what it was trying to do with each episode, a more disciplined approach to the question of what the characters were for and how their specific natures should generate specific kinds of comedy. This discipline produced work that held up better season to season because it was working from a coherent foundation rather than assembling each episode from whatever seemed funny in the moment. The episode structure of American Dad, which required a beginning, middle, and end in the traditional sense, forced the writers to think about causation. Things had to happen for reasons. Character choices had to flow from who the characters actually were. Jokes had to emerge from situations rather than being imported into them. This is more demanding work than the Family Guy model, which allowed the writers to sequence jokes without requiring that they connect to each other or to the characters making them. The demand produced better results over time, because good work under constraints develops different creative muscles than work that can always fall back on an easy option. The audience differences between the two shows also reflect their different approaches. American Dad's audience, while smaller than Family Guy's at its peak, tended to be more engaged with the show on a per-episode basis, more likely to discuss specific episodes in detail, more likely to recommend particular seasons to new viewers. When a show tells complete stories with real stakes, the audience has more to talk about than when a show assembles clips. The conversation around American Dad in fan communities tends to be about specific episodes and character moments and seasons that represent growth. The conversation around later Family Guy tends to be about specific clips divorced from their episodes, which is a reflection of the show's own internal logic about what the fundamental unit of comedy was. This is not a criticism of the clip format as such. The early Family Guy clips that went viral were genuinely funny and genuinely contributed to the show's enormous cultural influence. But there is a real difference between a show that produces memorable clips and a show that produces memorable episodes. And over the long run, the second kind of show is the one people return to. You return to episodes. You share clips. The clip economy benefits a show in the short term and can obscure a structural weakness that only becomes apparent over years of continued production, when the clips keep coming, but the episodes feel increasingly hollow. This is the most honest and most humbling thing that can be said about Family Guy's decline. It was not inevitable. The evidence that it was not inevitable exists. The evidence is called American Dad, and it runs on the same network, from the same studio, by the same creator, telling you every week what Family Guy could still be if the people in charge had made different choices. Section 14. The legacy, the regret, and the future what we're left with. So, where does all of this leave us? Family Guy has been one of the most controversial shows in the history of American television for 25 years. It has generated more FCC complaints than almost any other program. It has been banned in multiple countries, or threatened with banning. It has sparked an official condemnation from a foreign government. It has generated national news coverage when one of its characters died. It has been the subject of a two-part episode of a rival animated show designed specifically to mock its creative approach. It has had its creator publicly describe his relationship with the network that airs it as a failing marriage. It has watched its viewership shrink from 22 million at its peak to fewer than 750,000 in its recent seasons. It has been renewed through season 27 by a deal that was announced in April 2025. The show that produced the first 3 seasons, the version of Family Guy that fans fought to bring back from cancellation and that Adult Swim reruns turned into a cultural phenomenon, was something genuinely special. It was an animated comedy with a unique sense of humor, original characters, and a genuine heart beneath all the transgression. It pushed boundaries in ways that felt purposeful. It was controversial because it mattered. When people get angry at art, it's often because the art is doing something real. The show that exists today is different in ways that are hard to fully reconcile with what it started as. The characters are recognizable but changed. The humor is present but feels different. The warmth that animated the early episodes has been largely replaced by something colder and more mechanical. And the audience, which once numbered in the millions and cared passionately enough to start petitions and flood social media and bring the show back from the dead, has largely moved on. What remains is the legacy. Seasons 1 through 3 are still what they were, genuinely funny and genuinely moving in ways that adult animation rarely manages. The episode where Peter and Brian get drunk and drive and then deal with the real consequences. The episode where Stewie and Brian go back in time and encounter the earlier versions of themselves. The quieter moments, Peter telling Lois he loves her, Brian at his best serving as a friend rather than a mouthpiece, Stewie's villain monologues landing with their original comic precision. These things are preserved. They exist. They are still funny. They will remain so. The controversies, even the worst of them, were part of what made the show significant. A show that nobody found offensive is often a show that nobody found meaningful. The PTC's 40-plus nominations for Worst Show of the Week, viewed from the right distance, are a kind of tribute. You only spend that much institutional energy attacking something that has power. The Venezuelan government only bans something that feels like a genuine challenge to authority. The South Park Manatee episode only gets made when Family Guy has become successful and culturally influential enough to be worth attacking. The ratings collapse is real and it tells a real story, but it does not erase the earlier story. Family Guy at its peak was one of the most important animated comedies of its era. It influenced the style and tone of adult animation in ways that can still be felt across the genre. The cutaway gag format, whatever its limitations when overused, became a defining element of comedy in the YouTube and social media era, perfectly calibrated for a world where short, self-contained clips would be extracted from their context and shared without it. The show understood, probably before anyone could have fully articulated it, that the clip was going to matter more than the episode. What happened to the show happened because of choices, as American Dad proves. But what happened to the show before those choices, in the first few seasons when it was genuinely working, was also the result of choices. The choice to build real characters with real warmth. The choice to keep the cutaways as a supplement rather than a substitute. The choice to let consequences land. The choice to care about the Griffins as a family rather than just as a delivery mechanism for jokes. Those early choices produce something worth caring about. The later choices produce something worth critiquing. Both versions of Family Guy have their place in the story of what the show was and what it became. It is worth spending some time on what the show's cultural legacy actually looks like, because the answer is more complicated than either the show's most passionate defenders or its harshest critics tend to acknowledge. Family Guy in its prime was genuinely influential on how comedy worked in the digital age. The show essentially invented the viral clip as a comedy format before anyone was fully using that phrase. In 2005, when the show returned from cancellation at the same moment that YouTube launched, the cutaway gag format turned out to be perfectly engineered for the clip economy. You could extract a 30-second cutaway from Family Guy, post it to a video sharing site, and it would get millions of views from people who might not have been watching the episode it came from. The humor was portable in a way that narrative-driven comedy was not. This influenced an entire generation of comedy creators. The quick cut, the random reference, the absurdist non sequitur as a comedic unit, all of these have Family Guy's DNA in them, whether or not their creators were conscious of the lineage. When you watch certain YouTube comedy channels or certain styles of social media humor that rely on non-contextual jokes that exist as self-contained 30-second moments, you are looking at something Family Guy helped create. The show shaped the format of comedy online in a way that is difficult to fully quantify because the influence is everywhere. The show also served as a laboratory for the kind of adult animation that came after it. It pushed the boundaries of what was permissible on broadcast television with enough persistence that those boundaries moved. Shows that came after Family Guy existed in a slightly more permissive landscape because Family Guy had fought those specific regulatory battles and generally won them. The FCC complaint history of Family Guy is also, from a certain angle, the history of adult animation establishing its right to exist in the form it wanted to exist in. The voice performances deserve acknowledgement that they often don't receive in discussions of the show's quality. Seth MacFarlane is one of the most technically accomplished voice actors in television history. He voices 4 major characters on Family Guy who are immediately distinguishable from each other in pitch, cadence, and personality. Peter's specific brand of oblivious cheerfulness, Brian's world-weary intelligence, Stewie's refined menace, Quagmire's suggestive drawl. These are all distinct and committed performances that hold up across hundreds of episodes spanning over 25 years. Alex Borstein's Lois, Mila Kunis's Meg, Seth Green's Chris, and Patrick Warburton's Joe have provided consistency and genuine comic craft through every creative era of the show. Whatever else changed, the voice cast never stopped working hard. The Emmy nomination in 2009 for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated show to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, was a genuine and significant cultural moment. Not because it indicated that Family Guy was necessarily better than every live-action comedy in its field that year, but because it represented the Academy acknowledging that adult animation had achieved a level of craft that merited inclusion in the conversation. That acknowledgement would not have happened without the specific work that Family Guy had done in the years leading up to it, and it opened a door for animated comedy in the prestige television discourse that had been closed for nearly 5 decades. The 30-year anniversary is coming. The deal takes the show through 2029. Seth MacFarlane will keep recording his characters' voices in a booth somewhere in Los Angeles, and the writers will keep producing scripts, and the animation will keep being produced, and Family Guy will keep airing wherever Fox puts it, drawing its diminished but loyal audience. There is something worth sitting with in the idea of a show that nearly 1 million people still watch every week in the year 2025 and beyond. 1 million people is not nothing. It is, in fact, more people than can fit in most stadiums. More people than live in some of the world's most famous cities. The cultural instinct to describe diminished viewership as failure can obscure the real fact that there are still 1 million human beings choosing to spend 22 minutes of their week with the Griffin family. Some of them are doing it out of habit. Some of them are doing it because the show occasionally still produces something that reminds them of why they loved it in the first place. Some of them are doing it because it's on, and it's familiar, and familiarity has its own value. The thing about cultural phenomena is that they very rarely end cleanly. They taper, they shrink, they persist in diminished form for longer than anyone expected. The conversation around them moves on before they actually stop. Family Guy is in that phase now. The phase where the cultural conversation has largely moved on, but the show itself continues, producing episodes and airing them, and being watched by the fraction of its original audience that stuck around. Whether any of it has the spark that made those first 3 seasons matter is a different question. Sparks are fragile things. They need specific conditions to catch and hold. Family Guy had those conditions once, briefly and brilliantly, and the 20-odd years since have been the story of those conditions slowly changing until the spark was mostly gone. But mostly gone is not entirely gone. The best episodes of the later seasons are a reminder of that. the Vault episode in Season 8, the occasional Stewie Brian adventure that still lands. The moments where a character says something that sounds like who they actually were in the beginning, these things still happen, still break through. They just happen less often than they used to, surrounded by more noise and more content that isn't quite working. What's left is the show, still running, still occasionally funny, still capable, in its best moments, of doing something that reminds you of what it was. Still generating the occasional controversy that generates the occasional headline. Still filing new complaint fodder into the FCC's perpetually filling inbox. Still making someone, somewhere, very angry about something a cartoon dog said on Wednesday night. You can watch the early seasons and understand why people loved it enough to bring it back from the dead. You can watch the later seasons and understand why the people who brought it back eventually stopped watching. The gap between those two responses is the entire history of the show compressed into a single observation. Both things are true. Both things are Family Guy. The controversies documented here span 25 years of arguments about what comedy can do and what it should do, about who gets to be the target of laughter and what the cost of being that target actually is, about the relationship between creative freedom and creative responsibility, between what entertains and what illuminates, between a show that mattered and a show that continued. They are arguments that don't have clean endings because the questions they're asking don't have clean answers. What is humor for? What do we owe the people we make the targets of our jokes? What does it mean when a show outlives its own creative vision? When is a character being pushed past their nature by writers who've run out of ideas? And when are they genuinely evolving into something more complex? These are real questions that Family Guy raised, often inadvertently, across its long run, and the fact that they are still being asked, still being debated in the spaces where television and culture intersect, is itself a kind of legacy. There is something worth saying about the audience that stayed, too. The people who have watched every season, who remember where they were the night Brian died, who can quote the Vault episode between Stewie and Brian from memory, who have strong feelings about which era of Stewie was the best version of the character, who argue in comment sections about whether Season 7 or Season 5 was the last genuinely great season. These people represent a form of cultural engagement that is actually quite rare. Most television shows are watched passively. Family Guy, even at its most imperfect, has always inspired something more like active relationship from its most devoted fans. They have opinions, they have grievances, they have specific episodes they defend and specific episodes they will never forgive. That kind of passionate engagement with a piece of popular art is worth something, even when the art is mixed. The question of what Family Guy's final chapter looks like is genuinely open. The Disney-Fox deal takes it to Season 27, to the show's 30th anniversary in 2029. Whether MacFarlane becomes more creatively involved in the later seasons, whether the addition of more diverse voices in the writing room continues to improve the treatment of characters like Meg, whether the show finds some way to recapture the specific energy that made those first 3 seasons matter, none of these things are determined. Television surprises people. Shows that seem terminally in decline produce seasons that remind everyone why they mattered. It would be premature to write the final obituary for a show that is still actively being made. What the show's long controversial history teaches, if it teaches anything, is that the relationship between a show and its audience is a real relationship with real stakes. When Family Guy was at its best, it gave its audience something true, something that made them laugh in the specific way that good comedy makes you laugh, by illuminating a piece of the world you hadn't fully seen before. When it was at its worst, it exploited that relationship, using the emotional investment that good work had built to deliver content that didn't earn the investment. The audience felt the difference, even when they couldn't always articulate it, and the ratings told the story of what that feeling cost. The show that made a young Seth MacFarlane one of the most powerful people in American animation is still running. The world it created, the specific mixture of warm and cold that made the early seasons both funny and occasionally moving, is mostly gone now, replaced by something that runs on the same machinery but feels fundamentally different to spend time with. But the influence of those early seasons on animation, on digital comedy, on the culture of adult humor in American television is not gone. It persists in things that reference it and things that react against it and things that simply grew up in its shadow without quite knowing it was there. That is what it means to have mattered. The controversy was always proof of the mattering. A show that nobody cared about wouldn't have generated 188,000 FCC complaints. It wouldn't have inspired Trey Parker and Matt Stone to dedicate an entire two-part episode to attacking it. It wouldn't have caused Venezuela to issue warnings to cable networks. It wouldn't have trended globally when a cartoon dog was hit by a car. It wouldn't have been brought back from cancellation twice by fans who refused to accept its absence. Family Guy mattered. It still does, in the diminished and complicated way that things matter when they have moved past their peak but haven't yet reached their end. The controversies are part of that mattering. The decline is part of it. The 25 years of people arguing about what the show was doing right and wrong, and why it used to be better, and whether it still had any of the old spark, all of that is the shape of something that was genuinely significant in American popular culture, that genuinely changed what adult animation could be and what audiences would accept from a cartoon on primetime network television. That is the Family Guy story. Messy and overcomplicated and frequently uncomfortable, full of genuine brilliance and genuine failure, capable of producing work that was both some of the most insightful comedy of its era and some of the laziest and most irresponsible content on broadcast television. Both things at once, the whole time, for 25 years and counting. The Griffins are still out there on Spooner Street, still dysfunctional, still occasionally surprising, still generating, somewhere in a network executive's email inbox, a letter of complaint from someone who cannot believe what was on television last Wednesday. Same as it ever was, sort of. That's the whole story. Or as much of it as fits in one night. If this kept you company tonight, it means a lot. Drop a like if you're so inclined, subscribe if you haven't, and sleep well.